I left Seattle behind with nothing more than a few belongings, a collection of paints and sketchbooks, and an insatiable longing for something real, something unmediated by concrete and neon. I, Clara Hastings, had always believed that art was born of raw emotion and authentic experience. So, when the opportunity arose to build a small cabin on the edge of Olympic National Park near Forks, Washington, I leapt at it. The promise of solitude, the endless murmur of ancient trees, and the ceaseless patter of rain against weathered wood beckoned me like a whispered secret. I arrived on a dreary autumn day, the sky a heavy quilt of gray, and was immediately struck by the timeless quality of the landscape. Towering cedars, their trunks gnarled by centuries of rain and wind, rose all around me as if to guard the mysteries of the forest, and the scent of wet earth mingled with a delicate hint of moss and pine. My first days were filled with both wonder and the practical challenges of off-grid living. I spent long hours restoring the old cabin, learning to coax heat from a wood stove and to gather water from a nearby creek. Mornings were a quiet ritual. I would brew my coffee over a small fire, step outside, and let the fresh, cold air awaken my senses. The damp chill clung to my skin as I ambled along the narrow, winding paths through the forest, my boots sinking into the spongy earth. Every rustle of the leaves and every distant call of a bird seemed to sing of a secret history, of lives once lived and stories long forgotten. I set up a modest studio in a corner of the cabin, where large windows framed the shifting vistas of rain-soaked trees and misty valleys. There, with my pencil in hand and a blank sheet waiting to be filled with the essence of the wild, I sought to capture the soul of the place. For weeks, the forest became both muse and companion. The steady rhythm of rain and the soft, almost musical hum of nature provided a backdrop that allowed my imagination to flourish. Yet, even as I lost myself in the quiet beauty of each day, I could not shake the feeling that something was amiss, a subtle dissonance beneath the familiar sounds of nature. It happened one night as I sat by candlelight, sketching the elegant curves of a cedar limb against the stormy window pane. The gentle flicker of the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly in tune. Then, amidst the low murmur of the rain, I began to hear soft, almost imperceptible whispers. At first, I thought them to be the wind rustling through the trees, but soon I realized that their cadence was too deliberate, too human to be carried solely by the breeze. The voices seemed to murmur my name, to speak in a language that was both haunting and familiar. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a neighbor or perhaps a lost traveler, but the darkness revealed only the shifting silhouettes of the forest. One moment, I caught a glimpse of a pale figure moving between the trees, only to have it vanish when I strained my eyes to see more clearly. In the days that followed, the uncanny sensations persisted. I would be working on a painting when the whispering returned, louder and more insistent, as though the very air around me were alive with secrets. At times, I found myself pausing in mid-stroke, heart pounding, listening intently as the voices ebbed and flowed in a rhythm that matched the pattering of the rain. I began to doubt whether my own imagination, fueled by isolation and the ceaseless solitude of my new life, was to blame. Yet, the consistency of the phenomena, the soft murmurs at dusk, the fleeting figures glimpsed in the periphery during my walks, compelled me to seek an explanation beyond the realm of ordinary fear. Determined to understand the source of these disturbances, I turned to the local lore. I spent long hours in the modest library in Forks, poring over books of Native American legends and regional histories. In the margins of a weathered text on indigenous folklore, I read of ancient spirits said to wander the forests of the Pacific Northwest, restless souls bound to the land by sorrow and unfinished stories. The accounts described a spectral presence that drifted silently among the cedars, its voice a mournful echo carried by the wind. The parallels between these tales and my own experiences were too striking to dismiss as mere coincidence. My search for answers eventually led me to seek the counsel of a respected elder in the community, a man known as Chief Running Elk. I remember our first meeting vividly. In a small, unassuming community center in Forks, he greeted me with a calm, knowing smile, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that seemed to transcend words. I recounted my experiences in a halting, almost hesitant tone, unsure of how to convey the strangeness that had invaded my once peaceful haven. He listened intently, nodding slowly, as if each of my words affirmed a truth he had long suspected. "The forest speaks," he said in a low, gravelly voice that resonated with authority. "It calls to those who are sensitive to its song, and sometimes what you hear is the cry of a spirit bound by sorrow." His words, simple and direct, stoked both my curiosity and my apprehension. Over the next several days, Chief Running Elk and I embarked on a journey deep into the heart of the woods. He led me along forgotten trails and through stands of ancient trees, pointing out subtle signs that I had never noticed before. Small carvings on the bark of cedars, weathered symbols that hinted at rites performed long ago. With each step, the air grew denser, heavy with a sense of history and latent emotion. At dusk, when the forest softened into a twilight of murmurs and shadows, he guided me to a secluded clearing. In that open space, encircled by towering cedars, he performed a ritual cleansing. His voice rose in measured chants, ancient words that seemed to harmonize with the wind, and as he moved in a slow, deliberate dance, I felt as if the very spirit of the forest were stirred awake. For a brief moment, the incessant whispers that had haunted my nights fell into a reverent hush, and I experienced a fleeting sense of peace, a fragile truce between the living and the lingering past. After that night, I attempted to restore a semblance of normalcy to my life. I fortified my cabin with small talismans, carved cedar pieces, bundles of sage, and hand-painted symbols recommended by Chief Running Elk. I resumed my art with a renewed intensity, channeling my tumult of emotions onto canvases and paper. Yet, the forest's presence remained indelible. There were nights when I would work late into the darkness, the only sounds being the scratch of my pencil and the distant echo of the wind. And every so often, without warning, the soft whispers would swell into a chorus that filled the room, a haunting reminder that the unseen was always near. I began to keep a detailed journal, recording each unsettling encounter with meticulous care. I described the times when, in the dead of night, I awoke drenched in sweat, the ethereal voices lingering in my mind long after the rain had subsided. I noted the inexplicable phenomena, the strange, shifting silhouettes that danced among the trees at the edge of my vision, the cryptic marks left behind on the cabin's wooden beams, and the sudden chill that would descend upon me as if an unseen hand had brushed my shoulder. In these pages, I wrestled with the possibility that I was caught in the grip of an ancient, tormented spirit, one that had perhaps reached out to me in search of acknowledgement, or worse, to reclaim a long-forgotten grief. In time, the experiences began to coalesce into a narrative of their own, one that intertwined my personal journey with the enigmatic life of the forest. I found that my art itself was changing, as if influenced by the spectral presence. I would paint landscapes that seemed to carry hidden layers of emotion, a mist that swirled into ghostly faces, a stream that reflected not only the physical world, but also hints of sorrow and longing. There were mornings when, upon reviewing my work, I noticed that the shapes I had drawn in sleep, random lines and swirls, formed symbols reminiscent of the ancient carvings I had seen in the woods. It was as though the spirit was reaching out through my art, leaving behind subtle messages written in the language of dreams and intuition. Despite the mounting evidence of something beyond the ordinary, I remained conflicted. A part of me was terrified, haunted by the notion that my solitary refuge might harbor a presence that defied explanation, one whose intentions were as inscrutable as the shifting mists of the forest. Yet another part of me felt an inexplicable connection, a profound kinship with this silent wanderer whose sorrow seemed so achingly familiar. Perhaps, I reasoned, my arrival here was no accident. The forest, with all its beauty and mystery, had called to me for a reason beyond mere escapism from urban chaos. As the weeks melted into months, the boundary between fear and fascination began to blur. I spent long hours meditating beneath the ancient cedars, allowing the rhythmic patter of rain and the gentle sway of branches to lull my restless thoughts. In those moments of stillness, I sensed that the forest was communicating in a language far older than any I could articulate, a language of whispers, of sighs, and of the soft, enduring pulse of the earth itself. I spoke aloud into the darkness, offering words of comfort and silent apologies for any unintentional trespass I might have committed. I asked the spirit to reveal its name, its story, so that I might understand its pain and perhaps help to ease its burden. Often the reply was but a gentle exhalation of wind, a momentary rustle among the leaves, as if the forest acknowledged my plea without fully unveiling its secrets. One day, I decided to explore further than I had ever ventured before. The season was shifting, and with the arrival of early winter, the forest adopted a somber, reflective mood. I set off along a narrow, overgrown trail, the damp ground soft beneath my boots, and the cold air biting at my cheeks. The deeper I walked, the more the forest seemed to envelop me, each step taking me further into a realm where time and memory intertwined. I soon found myself in a small clearing dominated by a lone, ancient cedar, whose massive trunk bore deep scars and strange carvings. The tree's weathered bark told silent stories of a past steeped in both sorrow and resilience. Kneeling before it, I traced the enigmatic symbols with trembling fingers, feeling an electric current of emotion pass through me, a mingling of grief, longing, and an inexplicable sense of kinship. In that moment, the tree was no longer merely wood and bark, but a living repository of forgotten tales, a conduit through which the spirit of the forest might speak. I stayed in that clearing until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the mist in soft hues of gold and lavender. When I finally returned to my cabin, I felt as if I had been touched by something ineffable, a silent promise that I was part of a larger, timeless dialogue between the past and the present. Back at home, I channeled the intensity of the experience into my art, producing canvases that vibrated with a deep, resonant melancholy. Every brush stroke carried echoes of the forest's ancient pulse, and every color seemed imbued with the hidden sorrow of a spirit seeking solace. Yet, not every night brought such reflective calm. There were evenings when the quiet murmur of the forest would crescendo into something almost unbearable, a chorus of soft, layered voices that seemed to seep into my very bones. During these nights, I would sit by the small, flickering fire in the cabin, the shadows playing across the walls, and listen as the wind whispered through the cracks in the window. I learned to interpret the subtle changes in tone and rhythm, discerning in the murmurs hints of warning or perhaps calls for aid. There were times when I awoke suddenly, heart racing, convinced that I had sensed a presence at the foot of my bed, a fleeting warmth, a whisper of breath on my ear, before the darkness swallowed it whole. In those moments, I felt both terror and an inexplicable, almost tender sadness, as if the spirit were reaching out in its own solitary way. Life in the Olympic woods, with all its beauty and its inexplicable terror, gradually reshaped my inner landscape. I came to understand that isolation, while often a source of creative freedom, also magnified every small sound and shadow, until they became profound echoes of a larger mystery. I embraced a daily routine that balanced practicality with ritual. I tended a modest garden, gathering what little produce the land offered, and I maintained a respectful vigil over the natural world around me. I even adapted my art to reflect the duality of my experience. Vivid landscapes intertwined with spectral figures, serene skies punctuated by enigmatic shapes. Each piece became a dialogue between the seen and the unseen, a testament to my evolving understanding of the forest's language. As winter slowly yielded to the tentative warmth of spring, the forest began to reveal a softer side. The oppressive mist lifted in places, allowing shafts of sunlight to break through the canopy and cast intricate patterns on the forest floor. Dew glistened on the spider webs like strings of tiny pearls, and the awakening underbrush exhaled the scent of renewal. Yet, even in these moments of beauty, I could not forget the weight of the past that clung to every tree and every stone. I found myself pondering the nature of memory and loss, realizing that the ancient spirit might be a mirror of our own hidden sorrows, a manifestation of the grief that, despite the passage of time, remains etched in the very fabric of existence. I began to see the forest as a living tapestry, each element, every rustling leaf, every distant call, interwoven with stories of love, loss, and hope. The spirit, with its soft, elusive presence, was not merely a harbinger of fear, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of nature. I became increasingly aware that my creative journey was inextricably linked to this mysterious companion. My art grew richer, layered with the textures of raw emotion and the silent dialogue between humanity and the natural world. I no longer regarded the eerie whispers as threats, but as gentle invitations, calls to delve deeper into the collective memory of the land, to understand the sorrow and beauty that coexisted in every droplet of rain and every flicker of candlelight. There are still nights when the rain taps persistently against my window and the forest seems to hum its ancient lullaby. In those moments, I sit by my easel, brush poised in hand, and let my heart speak through the colors and shapes that emerge on the canvas. The spirit, ever present and enigmatic, lingers in the background, a silent witness to my struggles and triumphs. I have come to accept that its presence is a part of this place, as intrinsic as the cedar trees and the ceaseless song of the rain. I remain here, not because I have conquered my fear, but because I have learned to live in harmony with the unknown, to honor the delicate balance between beauty and terror. Now, as I write these words, I feel the quiet assurance of a life fully lived, a life that embraces both the light and the shadows. The forest, with its whispered secrets and ancient pulse, has become a mirror in which I see not only the reflections of my own soul, but also the enduring legacy of those who have come before me. I have learned that true creativity is born of this intricate dance between the seen and the unseen, between the tangible present and the ethereal echoes of the past. In the interplay of shadow and light, I have found a truth that is both humbling and transformative. There are still moments, particularly on nights when the moon hides behind a veil of clouds and the rain drapes the world in silver melancholy, when I pause and listen. In those moments, I am aware of the timeless conversation that flows between the rustling leaves, the gentle murmur of distant voices, and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. It is a conversation that speaks of ancient sorrow and quiet hope, a reminder that even in the solitude of these woods, we are never truly alone. The spirit, with its silent yearning and elusive presence, has become a part of my daily life, a constant echo that enriches my understanding of what it means to be alive. I have come to realize that living off-grid in the Olympic woods is not merely an escape from the modern world, but rather an immersion into a realm where every sound, every rustle, and every whisper holds meaning. The challenges of isolation and the eerie encounters have forced me to confront the unknown within and without. In doing so, I have discovered that the boundary between terror and wonder is as thin as a breath, and that the very act of listening, truly listening, to the world around me is an act of courage and reverence. In the end, I have chosen to remain in this enchanted yet formidable place. I have accepted that the forest, with its ceaseless rain and silent spirits, is as much a part of me as my art, as my solitude, and as the whispered memories of long ago. I continue to build my days around the rhythms of nature, finding solace in the timeless dance of light and shadow, and drawing strength from the silent companionship of the ancient cedars. Each day brings new mysteries, and each night, as the rain whispers its endless song, I am reminded that the journey of understanding is ever unfolding, a continuous dialogue between the past and the present. So here I remain, in my little cabin on the edge of Olympic National Park, where the rain never truly ceases, and the forest speaks in a language older than time. I live with the knowledge that I am a part of something much larger, a story that has been told for centuries through the rustling of leaves, the murmur of ancient voices, and the enduring resilience of nature itself. And as I continue to create, to listen, and to learn from the silent spirit that dwells among the trees, I am forever changed by the beauty and the mystery that define this place. In this solitary life, where every whisper of the wind carries a fragment of forgotten lore, I have discovered that the true essence of existence lies not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to embrace it. The forest, in all its timeless complexity, has taught me that beauty and sorrow are inextricably linked, and that every shadow has its own story, a story that I am privileged to witness, to honor, and to share through my art and my words. I never imagined that fleeing the relentless hum of corporate life would lead me deep into the ancient, brooding heart of Pisgah National Forest. My name is Ethan Monroe, and after years of chasing quarterly reports and chasing deadlines, I traded in my tailored suits for a beat-up pickup and a vision of a simpler life. I built a modest, off-grid cabin near Asheville, North Carolina, convinced that the whispering pines and the quiet solitude of nature could mend the frayed edges of my soul. I prided myself on being a rational man, a man of science and logic, but nothing could have prepared me for what lay ahead. The first few weeks in my new home were marked by a series of small, practical challenges. The cabin itself was a relic from a bygone era, with creaking floorboards and drafty windows that made the winter nights seem even colder. I wrestled with unreliable solar panels and an aging generator that sputtered more often than it roared to life. Yet, in many ways, these inconveniences were a small price to pay for the freedom I craved. Each morning, I woke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through dense clusters of pine, the air cool and filled with the earthy scent of damp foliage. I would set out on long walks through dew-laden underbrush, marveling at the simple wonders of the forest, a rusted fern's frond unfurling, a spider's web shimmering with droplets like tiny jewels, and I felt, for a brief moment, that I had finally found a place where life was unburdened by the weight of modernity. It wasn't long before I began to notice things that defied my carefully honed skepticism. One evening, while making my routine rounds around the cabin to check that nothing was amiss, I spotted a set of footprints that immediately set my nerves on edge. They were arranged in a peculiar, almost deliberate circle around the cabin's perimeter. The impressions were neither entirely animalistic nor human. They were oddly shapeless, as if the prints had been made by something caught between worlds. I bent down to examine them, my mind racing through possible explanations. A stray dog, a curious deer, but nothing matched the distinct pattern etched in the soft mud by the dimming light. That night, as dusk fell and the forest grew a deep, velvety blue, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to rationalize the strange footprints. The wind whispered through the pines, and I could almost convince myself that nature was simply playing tricks on an overworked mind. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a sound began to creep into the silence, an intermittent, high-pitched giggle. It was not the laugh of a man, nor the shrill call of a child in play, but something altogether more unsettling. It floated on the air like a memory of lost joy, echoing between the trees and vanishing as quickly as it had come. For several nights thereafter, I experienced the same eerie phenomenon. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened to an inky blackness, those soft giggles would rise from the shadows, accompanied by a palpable feeling of being watched. I remember lying awake in my narrow bed, heart pounding as I listened to the gentle, almost musical chortles coming from the depths of the forest. At first, I tried to dismiss them as the trickery of a tired mind overreacting to isolation and stress. But when I caught sight of flickering movement at the edge of my vision, a flash of a small, indistinct figure darting behind a stand of trees, I realized that I could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that something beyond the ordinary was at work. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I set about documenting every odd occurrence with the meticulous precision that had served me so well in my corporate career. I rigged several cameras around the cabin, ensuring that every angle was covered, and installed audio recorders in strategic spots both inside and outside the house. Each morning, I would download the data and review hours of footage and recordings, searching for any sign of the elusive presence that haunted the nights. At first, the recordings yielded nothing more than the usual nocturnal symphony, the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of an owl, the gentle patter of rain against the roof, but slowly, patterns began to emerge. In several clips, I could distinctly hear the soft, almost childlike giggles intermingled with the natural sounds of the forest. The giggles were faint, sometimes barely audible, yet unmistakably present. Despite my best efforts at rational explanation, the mounting evidence unsettled me more than I cared to admit. My nights grew restless, and the isolation of the forest began to gnaw at the edges of my composure. During one particularly stormy evening, I sat huddled near the flickering light of my fireplace, the wind howling outside, and the rain lashing against the windows. I remember my hands trembling as I scrolled through the latest audio recordings on my laptop. The giggles were back again, louder and more insistent than ever, layered over a sound that I could only describe as the pained murmur of voices. In that moment, every rational explanation I had mustered crumbled beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. I was not alone, and whatever was out there was making its presence known in ways that defied logic. Driven by a mixture of dread and a desperate need for answers, I began to seek out local lore. I frequented the small libraries and community centers in Asheville and its surrounding areas, poring over old newspapers and historical records that chronicled mysterious occurrences in the region. What I found was a patchwork of stories, some whispered in hushed tones by locals at the diner on the edge of town, others detailed in obscure pamphlets left behind by long-forgotten historians. There were accounts of a tragic event decades ago, a family lost in a forest fire, their children left to wander the woods, their laughter echoing even as the flames consumed everything. Other stories spoke of unexplained disappearances and spectral figures that roamed the forest in the twilight hours. The more I read, the more it seemed that my own experiences were part of a larger tapestry of sorrow and loss, woven into the very fabric of these ancient Appalachian pines. I remember a particular afternoon when I visited a local historian known simply as Mr. Daniels. His small office, tucked away in a faded building on the outskirts of Asheville, was filled with yellowed photographs, brittle documents, and relics that spoke of times long past. Over a cup of lukewarm tea, I explained my experiences, the strange footprints, the recurring giggles, the inexplicable feeling of being watched. Mr. Daniels listened quietly, his lined face growing more serious as I recounted the details. After a long pause, he leaned forward and said, "There's a story here, one of deep tragedy and lingering loss. They say that the laughter you're hearing is not that of a playful child, but the echo of a joy that was stolen away too soon." His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if the very act of speaking the truth might summon the unseen. The forest holds the memories of those who were lost, and sometimes their spirits linger in the places where they met their end. His words, though delivered in a tone that sought to comfort even as they warned, sent a shiver down my spine. Armed with this unsettling context, I resolved to capture further evidence of the phenomenon. Night after night, I maintained my vigil, the cameras silently recording while I sat by the window, eyes straining against the darkness. I took meticulous notes, logging every detail, the precise time of each giggle, the variations in tone, even the subtle shift in the wind that seemed to accompany each eerie burst of sound. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the manifestations only grew more frequent and unnerving. On one particularly cold night, as I sat in my worn leather chair reviewing the latest footage, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of one frame, just beyond the reach of the cabin's porch light, I saw the unmistakable silhouette of a small child standing perfectly still. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct, yet the posture, an almost pleading stance, was painfully clear. I rewound the footage repeatedly, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the image remained stubbornly unchanged. The child's eyes, if they could be called that, seemed to hold a sorrow too deep for words, and in that silent moment I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to comfort this lost soul. But even as I longed to offer solace, the practical part of my mind, a part that had once thrived in the boardrooms of the corporate world, told me to be cautious. I was dealing with forces I did not understand, and the more I investigated, the more I realized that my off-grid sanctuary might be a haven for echoes of a long-forgotten tragedy. The nightly manifestations grew bolder. The giggles, once soft and distant, now seemed to swell into an almost overwhelming chorus, their sound weaving in and out of the natural din of the forest. I began to experience moments of disorientation. Sometimes I would step outside for a routine check of the cabin's perimeter, and find myself inexplicably standing in a different spot than where I'd intended to be, as if the forest itself had shifted around me. I would catch fleeting glimpses of small, darting shadows among the trees, too quick to be any animal I recognized, and hear the distant sound of laughter that felt both jubilant and mournful all at once. Sleep became a fragile commodity. I tried to maintain a strict schedule, waking at dawn, working on repairs by day, and vigilantly recording the nights. But exhaustion began to wear on me. In the midst of one particularly restless night, after an evening punctuated by an almost frantic series of giggles and what I could only interpret as whispered pleas for help, I made a decision. I would spend one full night in complete, unbroken observation. I set up every piece of equipment I owned, double-checked that every camera lens was clean and every microphone functioning, and then settled into my rickety chair by the window, determined to record everything. I scribbled notes in a battered journal, my handwriting betraying the anxiety I felt. Hours passed slowly in the oppressive darkness, the forest outside alive with sound and movement, yet I could detect no new developments. Just as I began to think the intense scrutiny had borne no fruit, I heard it, a clear, heart-wrenching cry that seemed to rise above all the other sounds. It was the cry of a child, laden with a sorrow so profound that it halted my breath. The sound reverberated through the cabin, echoing off the walls as though it sought to find an audience for its grief. In that moment, my rational world shattered completely. I scrambled to review the live feeds on my laptop, my pulse hammering in my ears as I desperately searched for any sign of movement. There, on the screen, in a shadowed corner of the frame, was the faint image of a small figure. The figure moved slowly, almost deliberately, toward the camera before pausing as if in silent acknowledgement of my presence. I reached for the phone to call someone, anyone who might understand, but the line was dead, the signal lost in the oppressive isolation of the forest. I was alone with this haunting presence, and the weight of it pressed down on me with an intensity I had never known. Over the next several days, I found myself trapped in a relentless cycle of fear and curiosity. My equipment continued to capture intermittent evidence of the spectral laughter and the fleeting images of a child wandering among the pines. I began to piece together fragments of the past from the local lore. A family who had perished in a fire, a tragedy that had left behind more than just charred remains. There were whispers that the children had never truly left the forest, their joy twisted into an eternal, ghostly lament. I started to feel as if I was intruding on a grief so ancient and profound that it was beyond my understanding. Every night became an ordeal. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the dark windows, straining to catch any sign of movement. The once comforting sounds of the forest now felt laden with hidden meanings and unspoken sorrow. I began to question whether my decision to come here had been a mistake, a foolish attempt to escape a world that no longer made sense, only to step into one where the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, had become irrevocably blurred. I considered abandoning the project altogether, packing up my belongings and leaving the forest to its own inscrutable devices. But even as the fear pressed in on me, a small, stubborn part of my rational mind clung to the idea that there had to be an explanation, something that could be understood and, perhaps, resolved. I immersed myself in research, poring over old diaries, newspaper clippings, and historical records that recounted the tragedies of this remote region. I discovered that the area around Pisgah National Forest had long been a place of both natural beauty and hidden sorrow, where folklore and history intertwined to create legends that defied the limits of logic. There were accounts of children wandering the woods in search of a way home, their laughter echoing in the silence as a reminder of lives cut short. The more I read, the more I began to suspect that the cabin, and perhaps the very spot on which it was built, had become a nexus for these lingering spirits. One rain-soaked evening, after a day filled with a heavy sense of dread and uneasy anticipation, I decided to confront the phenomenon head-on. I set out into the forest with my camera slung over my shoulder, determined to find the source of the voices that had haunted my nights. The path was slick with mud and lined with gnarled tree roots that seemed to claw at my boots. Every step was accompanied by the persistent patter of rain and the rustling of leaves, as though the forest itself were whispering secrets just beyond my grasp. I followed the faint echoes of laughter until I reached a small clearing, the ground littered with fallen leaves and broken twigs. In the center of the clearing stood a large, weathered oak that seemed to have witnessed centuries of sorrow and joy. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening to the murmurs of the wind, half expecting the ghostly giggles to crescendo into something more tangible. Then, as if on cue, a gentle voice, fragile and filled with despair, drifted through the air. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the tree or the surrounding darkness. The voice was not loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft plea, a call for help that tugged at the deepest corners of my memory. I reached out instinctively, as if to comfort an old friend, but my hand met only the cool, damp air of the night. The voice faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that was even more oppressive than the cacophony of sounds before it. I retreated slowly, my mind reeling from the encounter, and found my way back to the relative safety of the cabin. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what I had experienced. I replayed the images and audio recordings, searching for any sign that might provide clarity. The spectral images of the child and the recorded cries haunted me, a constant reminder that I had stepped into a realm where the rational and the paranormal converged. Despite my best efforts to remain detached and analytical, I found myself increasingly overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the encounters. The once familiar patterns of my daily routine, the methodical checking of equipment, the deliberate pacing of the day, began to dissolve into a fog of uncertainty and dread. One morning, after a particularly stormy night that had left the cabin shrouded in an almost tangible gloom, I sat at my battered desk and made a decision. I realized that I was no longer simply an observer or a researcher. I had become an unwilling participant in a drama that was far larger than I could ever comprehend. The laughter, the footprints, the spectral images, they were not random anomalies to be catalogued and dismissed. They were echoes of a deep, unresolved sorrow that demanded acknowledgement, a grief that had woven itself into the very fabric of this forest. Yet, as much as I felt compelled to understand, a primal instinct urged me to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had taken hold of my life. That night, as rain hammered relentlessly on the roof and the wind moaned like a lament through the pines, I made my final decision. I would leave the cabin. I spent the evening packing a few essentials, a change of clothes, my journal, some photographs of the forest that I had taken in brighter days, and prepared my truck for the journey back to civilization. As I loaded the last of my belongings, I paused outside in the downpour, gazing at the dark silhouettes of the trees that had both enchanted and tormented me for weeks. I felt a pang of regret mixed with relief, a sorrowful farewell to a place that had offered me both beauty and terror in equal measure. I drove away in the early hours of dawn, the forest receding in the rearview mirror like a half-remembered nightmare. The giggles, the soft voices, the inexplicable images, they continued to echo in my mind long after I had left. In the quiet hum of the highway, I struggled to reconcile my desire for rational understanding with the undeniable evidence of something far beyond the limits of logic. The memories of that final night in the cabin, of the childlike laughter that had haunted the darkness, stayed with me like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. I found myself questioning everything I once believed about the nature of reality, about the boundaries between the living and the dead. In the months since my departure, I have returned to the edges of civilization, surrounded by the comforting clamor of human life and technology. Yet, even in the midst of urban chaos, I sometimes catch myself listening for that faint, distant giggle, a reminder of the inexplicable encounters I experienced among the Appalachian pines. I continue to sift through my recordings and journal entries, searching for clues that might explain the phenomena, but the forest seems to have reclaimed its secrets once more. Every so often, I receive a shiver when a familiar scent or the rustle of leaves in a quiet park stirs memories of that isolated life, of nights filled with spectral laughter and the weight of unseen sorrow. I have come to accept that some mysteries defy neat explanations. In the rational world I once inhabited, everything could be dissected, analyzed, and categorized. But out there, in the dark recesses of Pisgah National Forest, the inexplicable giggles and ghostly images remind me that there are forces and memories that linger beyond the realm of logic. I have no grand theory to explain the phenomena, no neat conclusion to tie together the fragments of lost voices and lonely footsteps. All I have are the memories, an indelible record of nights when the forest came alive with the voices of those who had been forgotten, whose joy had been transformed into an eternal, sorrowful echo. Now, As I write this account from the safety of a bustling city cafe, I cannot help but feel a bittersweet mix of relief and regret. I left the cabin not because I doubted the existence of what I had experienced, but because I recognized that the weight of that sorrow was too great for me to bear on my own. The forest, with its endless pines and whispered secrets, remains a place of both wonder and melancholy, a repository for the lost echoes of a tragedy that time has not healed. I have moved on with my life, yet I carry with me the memory of those haunted nights, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, and the persistent, childlike laughter that once filled the darkness. In the end, I realize that my time among the Appalachian pines changed me irrevocably. It shattered the comfortable illusion of a purely rational world, and forced me to confront the notion that some mysteries are meant to be experienced, rather than solved. Even now, when I try to convince myself that what I witnessed was merely a trick of isolation and overactive imagination, a soft giggle in a quiet moment can transport me back to that eerie, rain-soaked night. And in that moment, I know that the forest still whispers its secrets, secrets that belong to a past filled with both beauty and sorrow, secrets that, despite my departure, will forever echo in the corners of my mind. I leave you with this confession. I tried to live a life of logic, of order and reason, but sometimes the unknown intrudes in ways that shatter even the strongest of convictions. The off-grid life I once sought as an escape turned into a journey into the heart of mystery, a journey that taught me that not all that is unexplainable should be confined to the realm of science. There are echoes in the dark, voices that defy explanation, and laughter that rings out as a lament for those who can never return home. And, though I have long since left the forest behind, its whispers remain with me, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. I have always believed that the solitude of nature could mend even the deepest wounds. So, when my heart lay shattered by loss and regret, I sought refuge in the ancient embrace of the Blue Ridge Mountains. My name is Samantha Collins, and I arrived near Boone, North Carolina, with nothing but the remnants of a life once lived, and a fragile hope for renewal. I found a modest cabin nestled among towering oaks and whispering pines, a humble shelter that promised both isolation and the gentle caress of misty mountain air. The journey to that secluded haven was as much an inward pilgrimage as it was a physical escape from a world that had grown too painful to bear. The cabin was small, its wooden walls weathered by years of mountain storms and the relentless passage of time. I remember the first evening vividly. The sky bled into shades of lavender and indigo as twilight fell, and a heavy, silvery mist began to curl around the rugged peaks. I sat on the creaking porch, cradling a lukewarm cup of tea, and let the quiet envelop me. There was a serenity here that was both foreign and familiar, as if the land itself welcomed my broken spirit with a gentle, knowing sigh. In those moments, I dared to imagine that this was the place where I could rebuild, where every breath of cool, damp air might help exorcise the ghosts of my past. During my first few days, I immersed myself in the rhythms of mountain life. I rose with the sun, its early light filtering through the forest canopy in soft, golden beams. I ventured along narrow, winding trails where every footstep seemed to echo in a timeless dialogue with nature. The songs of unseen birds and the rustle of leaves provided a tentative comfort, a reminder that life persisted in quiet cycles. Yet, amid the routine of chopping wood, tending a small garden, and repairing the old cabin, an inexplicable feeling of unease began to thread itself through the stillness. It was as if the very land carried a secret, a sorrow too ancient to be forgotten. One early morning, as a dense fog clung to the slopes and transformed the world into a muted watercolor, I decided to take a walk by a nearby stream. The water, dark and reflective, wound its way through a bed of smooth stones and tangled roots. I remember standing at the water's edge, my breath visible in the crisp air, and noticing something that froze me in my tracks. In the mirror-like surface of the stream, I saw a reflection that was not entirely my own. For a fleeting moment, the face that stared back was slightly distorted, a ghostly echo with eyes that seemed too deep, too sorrowful. I blinked, convinced it was an aberration of light and mist, yet the image lingered in my mind long after I had moved on. That moment marked the beginning of an experience that would unravel the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. As days turned into weeks, the feeling of being watched became a constant companion. I would be working by the window, my fingers stained with ink from writing in my journal, when I sensed a pair of unseen eyes fixed upon me. The sensation was subtle at first, a mere prickling at the back of my neck, but as the mist thickened each morning, it grew into a palpable presence. I could no longer dismiss these moments as tricks of an overactive imagination born of solitude. The very atmosphere of the Blue Ridge seemed imbued with a quiet intensity, as though the mountains were harboring memories too heavy to release. At night, as I lay in bed, listening to the low, unending hum of the wind through the pines, I often found myself drifting into uneasy dreams, visions of shadowed figures moving silently among the trees and whispering voices that recited long-forgotten lamentations. I began to seek explanations for these experiences, feeling that the land was communicating in a language older than any I could understand. The locals, when spoken to with gentle curiosity, hinted at legends woven into the fabric of the region. I learned of an old witch's curse, a tale that had been passed down through generations, shrouded in both reverence and dread. It was said that many years ago, a powerful woman, sometimes remembered as a healer, sometimes as a sorceress, had been wronged by those who sought to exploit her gifts. In her anguish, she cursed the land, binding her sorrow to the very hills and forests. The curse was not malevolent in the sense of seeking to harm, but rather a perpetual echo of grief, an energy that seeped into the earth and the waters, haunting those who dared to live upon it. With each passing day, my intuition urged me to delve deeper into this legend. I began to visit the small, time-worn shops in Boone, where local artisans and elders spoke in hushed tones of the mountain's past. One afternoon, I met a gentle woman named Marjorie, a local herbalist whose eyes sparkled with both wisdom and a hint of sadness. Over a cup of chamomile tea in her sunlit parlor, surrounded by bundles of dried lavender and wild mint, I recounted my experiences, the disquieting reflection in the stream, the sensation of unseen eyes, the heavy mist that seemed to pulse with an almost sentient melancholy. Marjorie listened intently, nodding as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. "The Blue Ridge holds many secrets," she said softly, "and some of them are tied to old wounds. The curse, if you believe in such things, is a sorrow that lingers, but it is not without its remedies. There are rituals, old, gentle rituals, that can soothe the restless energy and offer protection. It may not banish the past, but it can help you live with it." Her words resonated with me deeply. I had come here seeking solace, a way to move beyond the grief that had shadowed my every step. And now it seemed that my healing might depend on facing not only my own sorrow, but also that of the land. Determined to reclaim a sense of peace, I arranged to meet Marjorie again, this time in the quiet clearing behind the herbalist's modest home. In that clearing, fringed by ancient oak trees and overgrown with ferns, Marjorie and I prepared a small ritual. She laid out a bundle of sage and sweetgrass, explaining in a measured tone how the smoke could carry away the heaviness of old curses. Together, we recited words passed down through generations, a prayer of protection, a plea for the land to remember its beauty rather than its pain. The ritual was performed at dusk, as the last rays of sunlight mingled with the gathering shadows. I remember standing there, feeling both vulnerable and empowered, as the fragrant smoke spiraled upward, carrying with it my whispered hopes and regrets. For a time, the oppressive weight that had so long burdened my soul seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet assurance. The land, too, appeared to respond. That very night, the mist was lighter, and the eerie sensations receded into a gentle murmur, as though the mountains were exhaling a long-held sigh of relief. Yet, even as the ritual had momentarily eased the malevolence that clung to the Blue Ridge, I could not shake the feeling that the presence was not entirely vanquished. In the weeks that followed, I continued my daily routines with a renewed sense of determination, yet the forest's whispers remained, a low, persistent echo at the edges of my consciousness. There were mornings when I would awaken with a start, certain that I heard soft voices on the wind, or catch a glimpse of a figure moving silently among the trees before vanishing into the haze. I documented these occurrences in my journal, my handwriting growing more fluid as I sought to capture both the beauty and the mystery of it all. Every entry was a small act of defiance against the despair that had once threatened to overwhelm me. Living in the Blue Ridge was an exercise in balance, a delicate dance between the tangible and the intangible. I took comfort in the daily rituals of tending to my small garden, in the simple satisfaction of gathering water from a nearby spring, and in the quiet moments spent reading by the fireplace in my cabin. Yet, I also learned to accept that some mysteries could not be fully unraveled. The land around me was alive with stories that stretched back to a time when the mountains themselves were young, when legends and reality were indistinguishable. I began to see my own pain as interwoven with the ancient sorrow of the place, a tapestry of loss and resilience that connected me to the countless souls who had come before. There were times when, standing on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley shrouded in mist, I felt a profound kinship with the mountains. The gentle caress of a cool breeze, the distant call of a solitary bird, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the dark were all reminders that life, in all its fragility, was an enduring force. In those moments, I let my grief mingle with the natural cadence of the world, accepting that healing was not about erasing the past, but about finding beauty in its remnants. I began to paint again, canvas after canvas, filled with the haunting hues of twilight and the ghostly silhouettes of trees against a pale sky. Each stroke of my brush became a silent dialogue with the land, a way to transform sorrow into art and pain into a memory that could be cherished. Even as I embraced this newfound connection, the underlying sense of unease persisted. It was not a terror that gripped me in the dead of night, but rather a constant, gentle reminder that the mountain held secrets not meant for the light of day. I learned to trust my instincts, to accept that some days the mist would come thicker and the shadows deeper, and that on those days I needed only to listen to the wind, to the rustling leaves, and to the quiet beating of my own heart. I began to understand that the curse Marjorie had spoken of was not an enemy to be vanquished, but rather a lingering sorrow that, like my own grief, required acknowledgement and compassion. In the gentle ebb of time, I found that the ritual had not banished the presence entirely, but had transformed it into something more bearable, a bittersweet echo of ancient pain, now intermingled with hope. There were still nights when I would lie awake, the soft murmur of voices weaving through the trees, but I no longer feared them. Instead, I found solace in the idea that I was part of a continuum, a living link in the chain of human experience that stretched back through centuries. The Blue Ridge Mountains, with their timeless majesty and lingering secrets, had become both a sanctuary and a teacher, urging me to confront the inevitable interplay of joy and sorrow that defined life. I made a conscious choice to remain here, embracing the daily challenge of coexisting with the unseen forces that wove themselves into the fabric of the land. Every morning, as I stepped outside into the cool, dewy air, I carried with me the quiet strength that came from having faced both the tangible and the mysterious. I learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey, a series of small, deliberate steps taken amidst moments of beauty and the occasional brush with something beyond comprehension. Now, as I sit by the window of my little cabin and watch the sun climb slowly over the misty peaks, I feel an enduring connection to this rugged, haunted land. The echoes of the past continue to whisper in the shadows, and though their voices sometimes carry a sorrow that mirrors my own, they also sing of resilience and renewal. I have come to see that every element of the Blue Ridge, the ancient trees, the winding trails, the shifting mists, is a part of a larger story that includes not only the tragedies of old, but also the quiet triumphs of the human spirit. In that understanding, I have found a measure of peace. There are moments, too, when I wander to the stream where that uncanny reflection first startled me, and I pause to gaze into its dark, rippling surface. Now, instead of fear, I feel a gentle curiosity, a recognition that what I saw was a part of the land's memory, a fleeting reminder that the mountains hold both the light and the shadows of life. I have learned to greet those moments with a soft smile, as if acknowledging an old friend who carries a secret too heavy for words. I continue to honor the rituals that have helped me bridge the gap between the seen and the unseen. Each time I light a bundle of sage or whisper a prayer of thanks into the cool night, I feel the presence of the ancient sorrow recede just a little, replaced by a fragile hope that even the deepest curses can be softened by compassion and time. The land may still be marked by the weight of an old grief, but it is also alive with the promise of new beginnings, a promise that I embrace with every beat of my mended heart. In choosing to remain in the Blue Ridge, I have accepted a life that is as much about confronting the mysteries of the world as it is about celebrating its enduring beauty. I have learned that even in the face of an ancient curse, there is strength in vulnerability, and that healing often comes from embracing both the light and the darkness. Each day here is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the eternal, quiet conversation between a person and the land that cradles their soul. Now, as twilight descends and the mountains shroud themselves in a soft veil of dusk, I feel neither alone nor afraid. Instead, I am filled with a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons learned in the whisper of the wind and the murmur of the ancient trees. I have come to understand that the echoes in the Blue Ridge shadows are not threats to be banished, but gentle reminders of a past that, while painful, also holds the seeds of transformation. And so, I remain here, an ever-evolving part of this living tapestry, drawing strength from the land and offering my own quiet tribute in return. This is my truth, a life woven into the enduring fabric of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where every ray of sunlight, every drifting mist, and every echo in the shadows carries the memory of those who have come before, and the promise of those yet to come. I am Samantha Collins, a woman reborn amidst ancient pines and rolling mists, determined to face each new day with courage, creativity, and a heart wide open to the timeless dialogue of life and loss. I never imagined that the quiet determination of my rational mind would one day be forced to reckon with something so ancient and unfathomable. My name is Marcus Reed, and I built my off-grid homestead deep in a secluded pocket of the Ozark Mountains near Branson, Missouri, with the firm belief that nature's raw beauty and isolation would bring clarity to a life that had grown too cluttered with modern distractions. I arrived in the Ozarks with a heart full of ambition and a mind tempered by skepticism, a man who trusted in hard work, self-reliance, and the measurable laws of nature. Yet nothing in all my years of logical inquiry could have prepared me for the darkness that lurked beneath the whispering pines and craggy outcrops of this rugged landscape. The journey here was an adventure in itself. I left behind a comfortable existence in the city, trading bustling streets and predictable routines for the uncharted territory of the wilderness. I purchased a modest tract of land that was rumored to be remote and undisturbed, a place where the modern world's reach would be nothing more than a distant memory. I envisioned a life of simplicity, mornings spent harvesting rainwater and tending to a vegetable garden, afternoons repairing old tools by the light of a kerosene lamp, and evenings under a canopy of stars unmarred by city glow. I approached every task with the precision of a man used to control, a man who believed that every variable, every setback could be accounted for. Yet in the Ozarks, nature had its own agenda. The first few weeks were a mixture of triumph and frustration. I labored to restore a dilapidated cabin, scavenged for firewood among stands of oak and hickory, and wrestled with the erratic performance of my solar panels and generator. There were days when the wind would howl unexpectedly, and torrential rains would disrupt my schedule, but I chalked these up to the unpredictable temperament of the wilderness. I was prepared for a few technical setbacks and occasional inconveniences. After all, self-sufficiency in a remote corner of America was never meant to be a luxury retreat. Yet, amid the daily grind of chores and repairs, I began to notice an undercurrent of something else, a presence that defied the simple explanations of weather or wildlife. It started subtly. On my very first night, I remember sitting by the single lantern I'd rigged up in the cabin's modest living space, the firelight flickering across walls stained with decades of weather and neglect. The silence outside was deep, punctuated only by the creak of old timbers and the distant murmur of a brook. And then I heard it, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. At first, I assumed it was the wind negotiating its way through the trees, but the sound was too deliberate, too resonant, as if it carried a weight of suffering or menace. Over the following days, the moaning persisted. It would come in intervals, sometimes as a solitary, forlorn groan late at night, other times as a chorus of disembodied sounds echoing off the rocky outcrops. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it might be the calls of a wounded animal, or the natural settling of the old cabin's structure. But the sound was not random. It had a cadence, a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I began to feel as though I was being watched, not by any creature of flesh and blood, but by something that dwelled in the spaces between shadow and sound. Then came the changes among my livestock. I had acquired a small herd of goats and a few chickens as part of my plan to live off the land, and for a time they provided both company and a tangible measure of life on my homestead. But soon I observed that they began to behave strangely. The goats would huddle together in corners of the barn, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they sensed an unseen threat. They would refuse to graze in the open fields at dusk, instead remaining in the shelter of the barn, with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. Even the chickens, usually restless and clucking with their own agitated energy, fell silent at the approach of night. The changes were subtle at first, and I convinced myself that perhaps a predator had been nearby. But no tracks, no signs of intrusion could be found in the soft earth, and yet the behavior persisted. The animals acted as if something in the night was scaring them, a presence that defied the natural order. I found myself torn between my innate skepticism and the mounting evidence of a phenomenon I could not explain. Every rational fiber of my being insisted that there was a logical explanation. A stray animal, a freak of nature, or even my own imagination playing tricks on me in the isolation. Yet, as the nights grew longer and the moans became a recurring symphony against the backdrop of a pitch-black sky, I could no longer ignore the sinister possibility that I was confronting something beyond mere natural occurrence. Determined to discover the truth, I embarked on a series of investigations. I scoured local archives and dusty county records in Branson, searching for any mention of strange happenings in the area. I spent hours in the local library, reading accounts of mysterious events in the Ozarks, tales passed down in whispered folklore about dark forces that had once roamed these lands. It was in one particularly weathered volume of regional legends that I first encountered the mention of a demonic presence said to haunt the hills. According to the old accounts, there was a time when the land had been cursed by an act of unspeakable evil, a curse that had left its mark on the very soil and air. The stories were vague, a patchwork of horror and regret, but one detail sent a shiver down my spine. The description of a presence that could drive even the strongest to madness with its oppressive weight. At first, I tried to dismiss the old legends as the superstitions of a bygone era, the remnants of an uneducated past. But as the evidence around me began to mount, the eerie moans in the night, the petrified behavior of my animals, and even a feeling that the very landscape was closing in with malevolence, I found that the rational part of me was fighting a losing battle against a tide of fear and curiosity. I began to document every occurrence meticulously, recording the exact times of the moans, noting the weather conditions, and even setting up a few simple, motion-sensitive cameras around the perimeter of the homestead. Each morning, I would review the recordings, scanning for anomalies, and each evening the dread would build anew as I awaited another encounter with the inexplicable. The turning point came on a night when the air felt charged with an almost unbearable intensity. I remember it clearly. The sky was overcast, the moon a mere sliver behind swirling clouds, and the wind had died to a heavy, oppressive silence. I was sitting at my workbench, methodically repairing a section of the cabin's wiring, when I heard the sound again, a deep, guttural moan that reverberated from somewhere outside, so close it seemed to press against the window. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as the sound grew louder, more insistent. I moved to the window, straining my eyes in the darkness, and saw nothing but the black mass of the forest. Yet I could feel it, the presence of something malevolent, something that had been waiting for a moment like this to make itself known. That very night, I experienced an encounter that shattered the last vestiges of my certainty. I decided to check on the animals, believing that if something was amiss, they might provide a clue. With a flashlight in hand, I stepped out into the cool, damp air. The barn was dark, the air thick with a musty odor, and as I moved closer, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, not coming from any of the animals. It was as if a being, something unholy, was standing just at the edge of the barn, watching. I felt a chill that was not due to the night air, a cold that seeped into my bones. My logical mind screamed for me to run, to hide behind the safety of my rationality. But my feet were rooted to the spot, and I could only stand there, paralyzed, as the oppressive presence seemed to envelop me. I retreated hastily back to the cabin, my mind racing to find an explanation, a rational framework that could contain what I had just experienced. I spent a sleepless night pacing the small rooms, the sound of my own breathing mingling with the echo of that ominous presence. In the hours that followed, I resolved to confront this entity head-on. I scoured the local folklore with renewed intensity, seeking any clue that might explain or even help banish the malevolence that had invaded my life. My research eventually led me to an old man in a small town a few miles from my homestead, a man known simply as Mr. Jenkins, whose family had lived in these parts for generations. His weathered face and soft, measured speech lent an air of credibility to his accounts of the old legends. Over a cup of strong black coffee in his cluttered, dimly lit living room, I recounted my experiences with as much detachment as I could muster. Mr. Jenkins listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed every detail. When I finished, he leaned forward and said in a gravelly tone, "Son, you've stirred up something that's been sleeping here for a long time. They say that in these hills there's a presence, an evil spirit. Some folks might call it the devil himself. It's not something you can fight with logic or tools. It's an ancient force, bound to these lands by old curses and bitter deeds. If you're going to face it, you need to do more than document it. You must confront it in the language it understands, the language of the old ways." His words left me unsettled but strangely determined. I spent the next few days poring over ancient texts and local manuscripts that detailed rituals and rites used by the early settlers and native peoples to ward off dark forces. I learned of a banishing ritual, a ceremony rooted in the folklore of the Ozarks that was said to repel the devil's influence. It involved a combination of symbolic gestures, the burning of certain herbs, and incantations passed down through generations. The ritual was not a guaranteed cure, but it was the only recourse I had to try and reclaim the sanctity of my home. That fateful evening, as the sun sank below the jagged horizon and the darkness of night began its slow, inexorable descent, I prepared myself for the confrontation. I gathered the necessary items, a bundle of sage and juniper, a small iron knife that had belonged to my grandfather, and a few pages from a tattered journal I had found in one of the local archives. With trembling hands and a mind torn between fear and determination, I stepped out into the front yard of my homestead, the only sound the rustle of dry leaves and the distant, low moan that had haunted me for weeks. I lit the bundle of sage and juniper, the fragrant smoke curling upward into the night air. I began to recite the incantations in a measured, deliberate tone, my voice wavering as the words of the old ritual filled the silence. I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me as I circled the cabin, each step imbued with the hope that this ritual might push back the malignant force that had invaded my life. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The oppressive silence seemed to press in on all sides. Then, as if in response to my desperate plea, the wind rose in a sudden gust, carrying with it a chorus of deep, guttural moans that rattled the very windows of the cabin. The air around me shimmered, and I could sense a presence drawing near, as though the darkness itself had taken on a physical form. I raised the iron knife, its cold metal a feeble shield against the ancient evil I was confronting. My heart pounded as I continued the incantation, my voice growing stronger with each word even as my hands trembled. The moans deepened into a resonant, almost mocking echo, and for a moment I felt as though the night itself was laughing at my futile attempt to restore order. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of dread and determination. Then, in a burst of sensation that defied description, I felt a force slam into me, a pressure so intense that it knocked the breath from my lungs and sent me sprawling to the damp ground. The world spun in a maelstrom of darkness and pain, and I heard, as if from a great distance, a voice that was at once both a hiss and a laugh, a voice that whispered, "You cannot banish what is eternal." I struggled to rise, the cold grip of fear and pain making every movement a monumental effort. The air around me pulsed with malevolent energy, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and merciless, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I continued the ritual, reciting the incantations with a desperate fervor. I pressed the knife into the soft earth as a symbolic offering, a final plea for deliverance. The wind howled around me, and for a moment I thought I saw a shape, part human, part something far worse, looming in the periphery of my vision before it vanished into the darkened trees. When at last the wind subsided, and the oppressive force seemed to recede into the shadows, I lay there on the cold ground, gasping for breath and wondering if the ritual had worked at all. The moans had ceased, replaced by an eerie, lingering silence that felt both temporary and foreboding. I slowly rose to my feet, my limbs heavy and numb, and returned to the safety of the cabin with a mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Had I truly repelled the devil's presence, or had I merely stalled the inevitable? The rational part of me wanted to believe that I had achieved something, that my determination and ancient words had driven back the darkness. Yet, deep down, I sensed that the evil was not so easily vanquished. It had been stirred, not destroyed. In the days that followed, I tried to restore a semblance of normalcy. I resumed my daily tasks with a cautious optimism, believing that the ritual had bought me time, if not complete salvation. Yet, as night fell, I could still feel that lurking pressure, a reminder that the presence had not been wholly banished. There were moments, as I lay awake in the small, creaking bed of my cabin, when I would sense a subtle shift in the air, a whispered reminder that the darkness was still near. I noticed that even the natural sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, seemed to carry an undercurrent of disquiet, as if the land itself had absorbed the memory of that terrible night. Despite my efforts to maintain a practical routine, the experience had irrevocably altered my perspective. I found myself spending long hours poring over old texts and talking with locals who, with quiet reluctance, admitted that there were things in these hills that defied simple explanation. I even took to roaming the property at dusk, half in search of evidence, half in silent prayer that I would not encounter that malevolent force again. Each time I ventured out, I carried with me a deep, instinctual wariness, a recognition that some forces are too ancient and too powerful for mere mortals to command. Over time, the strange occurrences did not vanish entirely. The deep, guttural moans would sometimes return on particularly still nights, echoing off the rock walls and stirring memories of that fateful confrontation. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I would occasionally catch fleeting glimpses of shapes that defied easy explanation. Yet, I also experienced moments of a curious calm, a quiet understanding that the presence, while terrifying, was a part of the land's enduring mystery. I began to document these episodes in a journal, not just as evidence of my ordeal, but as a testament to the enduring struggle between light and darkness that seemed to animate the Ozarks. Eventually, the persistent echoes of that demonic presence, combined with the emotional toll of living in constant vigilance, forced me to make a painful decision. The homestead that I had built with such determination had become a battleground, a place where every creak in the night, every rustle of leaves, was a reminder of the power I could neither fully understand nor control. I realized that, despite my best efforts and the brief reprieve the ritual had offered, the dark force would always linger at the edges of my existence, a relentless reminder that some evils are eternal. In the end, I chose to leave. Packing up my few belongings and the remnants of a life I had tried so desperately to carve out in the wilderness, I departed from that secluded corner of the Ozarks with a heavy heart and a mind forever altered by the encounter. As I drove away along the winding mountain roads, the misty silhouettes of ancient pines and rugged outcrops receded into the distance, but the memory of that oppressive presence clung to me like a shadow. I had left behind not just a homestead, but a part of myself, my faith in the unassailable power of reason, and the hard-won knowledge that some mysteries in this world are best left untouched. Now, many months later, I find myself in the safety of a small town far from the Ozarks, surrounded once again by the predictable rhythms of modern life. Yet, even here, in the hum of a society governed by the measured tick of clocks and the steady pulse of routine, I cannot entirely escape the echoes of that terrible presence. There are moments, late at night when the world is quiet, when a distant, low moan or the rustle of leaves in an empty alley triggers a memory, a reminder of that time when I stood face to face with something that defied explanation, something that had called itself the devil's presence in the Ozarks. I still keep my journal, now filled with pages of meticulous observations, descriptions of inexplicable phenomena, and the raw, unfiltered fear of a man who once believed that all could be explained by science and logic. I review those entries with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow, wondering if I might have done something differently, or if I had simply been a witness to forces far greater than I could ever hope to master. The rational part of me still clings to the belief that there is a logical explanation for every sound, every shadow. Yet the part of me that remembers that night knows that some doors, once opened, are not easily closed. I have learned that in the depths of the Ozarks, amidst the rugged beauty of ancient forests and stone-clad hills, there exists a realm where the line between the natural and the supernatural is blurred. A realm where the echoes of old curses and demonic presences continue to reverberate long after the last human voice has faded away. Though I have left that place behind, it remains with me in quiet moments of introspection, a testament to the enduring power of nature and the dark mysteries that lurk within it. In choosing to leave, I did not abandon my quest for understanding. Rather, I accepted that some mysteries are meant to be experienced, not solved. My time in the Ozarks has taught me that even the most logical, well-prepared mind can be humbled by the forces of the unknown. I have come to understand that there is wisdom in acknowledging our limitations, that the universe, with all its ancient secrets and hidden terrors, is larger and far more mysterious than our neat, rational explanations can ever capture. So now, as I sit in a small cafe in a bustling town far from the haunted silence of the mountains, I sometimes close my eyes and listen for that deep, echoing moan, that reminder of the devil's presence that once stalked the dark corners of my homestead. I have learned that fear, in all its raw intensity, can be both a warning and a guide, a force that compels us to confront the limits of our understanding and to respect the mysteries that lie beyond the realm of human control. I leave you with this truth, born of long nights in the Ozarks and a confrontation with an ancient darkness. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom is found not in banishing the unknown, but in learning to live with it, acknowledging its presence with both courage and humility. I am Marcus Reed, a man who once sought refuge in nature's embrace and instead found himself face to face with a darkness that defied explanation. Though I have moved on to a safer, more predictable life, I will never forget that night, nor the lessons it forced upon me about the fragile interplay between reason and the ineffable forces that shape our world. Even now, I wonder if, somewhere deep in the silent, mist-wreathed hills of the Ozarks, that malevolent presence still lingers, waiting for another soul to question its existence. And perhaps that is its true power, the knowledge that some mysteries are eternal, and that even the brightest light casts a long, dark shadow over the land. I left behind the relentless noise and clutter of urban life in search of something ineffable, a spark that would ignite my creativity and heal old wounds. I, Isabella Izzy Ramirez, had always been drawn to the mysterious, the things that lurked in the half-light between waking and dreaming. When the opportunity arose to rent a small off-grid cabin deep in the heart of Redwood National and State Parks, I embraced it without hesitation. I envisioned a haven where the ancient majesty of towering redwoods could whisper secrets to me, where each creaking branch and rustling leaf might stir the well of inspiration that had long run dry. I believed that there, amid the silent sentinels of the forest, I could pen the next great novel, a work born of both beauty and terror. The journey to my new retreat was, in itself, a pilgrimage. I remember the long, winding drive through narrow, fog-draped roads as the silhouette of the redwoods slowly emerged, their colossal forms like ancient guardians welcoming me into their domain. The cabin, a modest wooden structure weathered by countless seasons, lay hidden at the forest's edge, almost as if it had grown organically from the land itself. The first time I set foot on the soft, mossy ground outside my door, I felt an immediate, inexplicable connection, as though the earth was acknowledging my presence, inviting me to partake in its timeless story. In the early days, I immersed myself in the rhythms of the forest. Mornings greeted me with a delicate light that filtered through the towering trees, turning dewdrops into fleeting jewels on fern fronds. I spent hours wandering the labyrinthine paths, letting my senses guide me through a world that seemed simultaneously familiar and profoundly alien. There was a serenity here that spoke of ancient wisdom, a hush that allowed me to listen to my own heartbeat. I scribbled observations in my journal, noting the intricate patterns of lichen on weathered bark and the haunting calls of distant birds. It was during these quiet moments that I felt the first hints of something amiss, a subtle dissonance amid the symphony of nature. One late afternoon, as the sky burned with the last embers of daylight and shadows stretched long between the trees, I experienced a moment that would alter the course of my retreat. I had been following a narrow, winding trail deeper into the forest when I caught a glimpse of movement among the colossal redwoods. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a fleeting silhouette that darted behind a tree, too quick to be human. Yet something about its form was uncanny. As I paused, heart pounding in a sudden surge of adrenaline, I watched as the figure appeared again. This time, it seemed to shift before my eyes, morphing from a vaguely human shape into something indeterminate, a fluid mass of shadow and light that defied description. The figure's outline wavered, as if drawn in water, and in one brief, terrible instant, I swear I saw eyes, intense, unnerving eyes that glowed with a predatory gleam. I retreated hastily, the image seared into my mind, and my footsteps carried me back to the relative safety of my cabin. There, with trembling hands, I opened my journal and began to write, the words tumbling out in a mixture of awe and terror. I wrote of the way the redwoods seemed to close in around me, the oppressive silence punctuated by that impossible movement. I could not shake the feeling that I had intruded on a secret, a realm where the rules of reality bent under the weight of ancient magic. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in bed, haunted by the vision of that shifting figure. Every creak and rustle in the dark took on new significance, and I found myself glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the forest's edge. The following day, while exploring a small clearing near my cabin, I stumbled upon something even more disconcerting. In the soft, damp earth, I discovered a series of footprints, large, deliberate impressions that seemed far too big to have been made by any ordinary animal. They were arranged in an erratic pattern, as though the being had moved with both purpose and uncertainty, pausing occasionally to examine its surroundings. I knelt down, running my fingers over the impressions, feeling the strange texture of the mud, mixed with tiny fragments of broken twigs. A chill ran through me. I had heard legends whispered among locals about skinwalkers, beings capable of assuming multiple forms, both human and animal, sometimes said to be agents of ill omen. The footprints, the shifting silhouette, and the deep, unsettling sensation that something unseen was watching me. All these elements began to weave together in my mind into a tapestry of inexplicable dread. Over the next several days, I found myself increasingly obsessed with the enigma of that mysterious presence. Every time I ventured out into the forest, I did so with a mix of trepidation and anticipation. I meticulously documented every unusual occurrence in my journal, detailing the time, weather, and my emotional state. I wrote about the way the forest seemed to exhale in a low, almost imperceptible sigh when I passed by, and how the silence occasionally broke into strange whispered murmurs that I couldn't quite decipher. At night, I would sit by the small window of my cabin, peering into the darkness, and sometimes I thought I saw flickers of movement among the trees, a flash of color, a glint of those eerie eyes that had once met mine. I began to reach out to local historians and even a few reclusive residents who had long made the redwoods their home. In a small, cluttered bookstore in a nearby town, I met an old man who claimed to have heard the forest speak in its own language. With a gravelly voice, he recounted tales of skinwalkers, creatures not bound by the usual confines of form, capable of slipping between the guise of man and beast, leaving behind footprints that defied natural explanation. He told me that these entities were known to the native peoples long before modern settlers arrived, revered and feared in equal measure as spirits of transformation and doom. His words resonated with me, stirring a primal curiosity, but they also deepened the unease that had begun to take root in my heart. In the quiet hours of one particularly crisp night, emboldened by equal parts fear and determination, I decided to confront the enigma directly. I left a small offering, a bundle of fresh wildflowers and a few words of welcome, at the edge of the clearing where I had first seen the shifting figure. I whispered softly, "If you are here, show me your truth." I left, half expecting nothing to happen, but in the depths of the forest, a silence fell that was heavier than before, as if the very woods were holding their breath. For a moment, I felt a connection, a brief moment when the barrier between my reality and the other seemed to thin. But then, as if the forest were exhaling a long-held secret, the sensation faded, leaving me with more questions than answers. As the nights turned into a blur of restless sleep and fevered journal entries, the figure began to visit with increasing frequency. Sometimes it appeared at the very edge of my vision, a fluid, shifting mass that defied any fixed shape. Other times, I awoke in the pre-dawn darkness to find strange symbols etched faintly into the wooden exterior of my cabin, symbols that I later discovered bore a resemblance to ancient sigils mentioned in the old legends of the redwoods. I was no longer merely an observer. I was part of a dialogue, albeit one that was conducted in a language of mystery and half-remembered dreams. My creative mind, ever hungry for inspiration, struggled to balance the thrill of discovery with the gnawing terror that accompanied each encounter. There were nights when I would sit up in bed, paralyzed by a mixture of fascination and dread, as I listened to the whispers of the forest. I began to record these moments, the soft susurrations that seemed to emanate from all around me, a low, almost musical cadence that spoke of ancient sorrow and longing. The more I recorded, the more I noticed a pattern emerging, a rhythm to the appearances of the figure and the sounds that accompanied it. It was as if the forest were composing a symphony of its own, one that only those willing to listen could begin to understand. In the midst of these unsettling events, I attempted to return to my work as a writer. I had come here with the hope of finishing a long-delayed manuscript, a novel that had been simmering in the recesses of my mind for years. But as I sat before my typewriter, the clack of keys and the soft hum of creativity were disrupted by the relentless, inexplicable pull of the redwoods. My pages began to fill with descriptions of eerie luminescence, of the subtle interplay between shadow and light, and of a presence that both inspired and terrorized me. The manuscript became an extension of my own experiences, a chronicle of encounters with an entity that defied the rational, that danced along the edges of sanity. Every time I attempted to capture its essence, the words seemed to slip away like smoke, leaving only a trace of the indescribable feeling that had overtaken me. I became increasingly isolated, not by choice, but by necessity. The more I delved into the mystery of the Skinwalker, the more I found myself retreating into the labyrinth of the redwoods, where every turn held the potential for revelation or ruin. My days blended into one another, punctuated by solitary walks, fevered research sessions, and long nights spent deciphering the cryptic messages I believed the forest was sending me. There were moments of clarity, fleeting instants when the figure would appear and seem almost benign, as if it wanted to share its secrets, but these were always followed by periods of ominous silence and oppressive dread. One particularly disconcerting evening, as a dense fog began to settle over the forest, I found myself alone on a narrow path, illuminated only by the weak glow of a lantern. The air was heavy with moisture and the scent of damp earth, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. I paused to catch my breath when, out of the mist, the figure emerged once again. This time, it was not content to linger at the periphery of my vision. It stepped directly into the narrow beam of my lantern, and for a moment I was frozen by the intensity of its gaze. There was something profoundly human about the way it looked at me, a look that conveyed both sorrow and a challenge, as if it were questioning my right to be there. I could not discern its true form, for its shape shimmered and shifted, as if it were made of living shadow. All I could register were those eyes, deep and enigmatic, and a sense that I was in the presence of something far beyond my understanding. My pulse raced, and in that moment, the dual impulses of fear and curiosity collided. I raised my trembling hand as though to offer a greeting or a plea for answers, and the figure did something unexpected. It raised what appeared to be a hand in response. The gesture was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight of meaning that resonated deep within me. In that silent exchange, I felt an overwhelming urge to know more, to understand what force had chosen me as its confidant, its chronicler. And yet, even as that desire grew, a voice of caution whispered that some secrets were meant to remain hidden, that some mysteries carried with them a danger too great to unravel. In the days that followed, the presence became a constant companion. I no longer knew if I was dreaming or awake when I saw it, for its visits blurred the boundaries of time. I began to feel a pull toward the very heart of the forest, as if the Skinwalker were leading me on a journey deeper into the unknown. I followed it on more than one occasion, retracing its silent path through groves of ancient trees and along meandering, overgrown trails. Each step felt like an initiation into a realm that had existed long before human memory, a realm where the past and the present coalesced into a living, breathing myth. Yet, with every revelation came an increasing sense of foreboding. The more I learned about the legends of skinwalkers from hushed conversations with locals and faded pages in forgotten texts, the more I realized that I was entangled in a story that defied a simple ending. These beings were not mere figments of folklore, but emissaries of a force that had seeped into the very roots of the redwoods, a force that could neither be controlled nor completely understood. My journal entries grew longer and more frantic, detailing the minutiae of each encounter, each shift in the forest's mood. I wrote of nights when the wind carried voices that seemed to speak directly to my soul, and of mornings when the dew on the ferns glistened with an otherworldly light that made me wonder if the boundaries between life and something else were dissolving before my eyes. One afternoon, after a particularly disconcerting series of sightings, I returned to my cabin with a heavy heart and an unfinished manuscript that felt more like a confession than a work of art. I sat at my weathered desk, the soft patter of rain on the roof providing a melancholic rhythm, and tried to articulate the ineffable. I struggled to reconcile the rational part of me, the part that had once dismissed such encounters as tricks of light or overactive imagination, with the raw, visceral truth that pulsed beneath the surface of every experience. My thoughts were tangled, a mesh of awe, terror, and a desperate longing for clarity. I wrote of the figure's eyes, of the silent language it seemed to speak, and of the realization that I was no longer just a visitor in this realm, but an unwitting participant in a narrative that stretched far beyond my own existence. There came a moment, as I sat staring at the half-finished pages of my manuscript, when I realized that the redwoods were not going to reveal all their secrets to me. The allure of the unknown had, for a time, been the spark that fueled my creative fire, but it had also become a consuming force that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my sanity. The Skinwalker, with its shifting forms and enigmatic presence, was a mystery that refused to be tamed. I felt both privileged and cursed to have borne witness to it, a living testament to the fact that some truths are too potent, too dangerous, to be confined within the neat boundaries of words. In the final days of my sojourn, the visits grew more erratic, and with each encounter, the weight of the mystery pressed harder upon my soul. I found that I was no longer drawn solely by the promise of artistic inspiration, but by an almost obsessive need to escape the relentless pull of that otherworldly presence. The redwoods, once a sanctuary of quiet wonder, had transformed into a labyrinth of silent warnings, each rustle of leaves and shifting shadow a reminder that I was intruding on a domain that did not welcome intrusion lightly. My nights became a restless vigil, filled with the dread of knowing that with each passing hour, the Skinwalker's presence would return, perhaps bolder, perhaps more desperate, and always leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. I began to understand that the time had come to leave. My manuscript lay unfinished, a chaotic blend of brilliant insights and incoherent ramblings, an apt metaphor for the journey I had undertaken. I had arrived seeking solace and inspiration, only to find myself entangled in a narrative that I could neither control nor complete. With a heavy heart and a soul marred by both wonder and sorrow, I packed my few belongings and prepared to depart from the redwoods. The decision was not made lightly. Every fiber of my being longed to uncover more, to dive deeper into the mystery that had so profoundly altered my perception of reality. But I had also learned that some forces, once disturbed, are not meant to be understood by human hands, and that the cost of seeking absolute truth can be a price too steep to pay. On my final night, I walked once more beneath the towering redwoods, the forest bathed in the soft luminescence of a full moon. The air was cool and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and pine, and I could hear, as if in a distant echo, the murmurs of the ancient trees. I paused in a small clearing where the presence had made itself known so many times before. In the silence, I felt a palpable tension, a delicate interplay between the seen and unseen. I closed my eyes and whispered a farewell, not just to the physical space of the forest, but to the mystery that had claimed a piece of my heart. I knew that even as I left, the memory of those enigmatic eyes and the shifting form of the Skinwalker would forever linger in the recesses of my mind, an indelible mark of a truth that defied simple explanation. The next morning, I departed with a mixture of relief and profound melancholy. The redwoods receded in my rearview mirror as I drove away, their towering silhouettes a constant reminder of the beauty and terror I had encountered. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to reconcile my experiences with the world I had returned to. I attempted to continue writing, to channel the raw intensity of the redwoods into my work, but the manuscript remained unfinished, a fragmented narrative of moments that had defied the neat confines of language. I shared my account with a few trusted friends and fellow writers, hoping that in their eyes I might find some validation or understanding. Some dismissed my story as the overactive imagination of a solitary artist, while others nodded in silent acknowledgement, their eyes reflecting a glimmer of recognition for a mystery that, in their own way, haunted them as well. Now, as I sit in the quiet corner of a small, sunlit cafe, far removed from the dark, whispering groves of the redwoods, I find that my thoughts often drift back to that time. I remember the feeling of awe as I first stepped into that ancient forest, the thrill of discovery tempered by an ever-growing sense of dread. I recall the moment I saw those shifting eyes and the chill that ran through me. a visceral reminder that some mysteries are larger than our capacity to understand. I know that the redwoods still hold their secrets, that somewhere in their depths the skinwalker still roams, a silent guardian of truths too elusive for mortal comprehension. My manuscript remains unfinished, a testament to both my passion for the unknown and my ultimate surrender to forces beyond my control. I sometimes wonder if I left too soon, if I might have unraveled more of the mystery had I stayed. But then I recall the unyielding gaze of that shifting figure, and the overwhelming sense of being observed by an intelligence that did not belong to our world. I realize that my departure was not an abandonment of the search for truth, but rather an acceptance that some enigmas are meant to be experienced, if not fully understood. The redwoods have become a part of me, a lingering presence in my memories and in the quiet spaces between my thoughts. Their ancient, unyielding beauty and the haunting echoes of that otherworldly encounter have forever altered my perception of reality. I write now with a cautious reverence for the mystery, acknowledging that in the interplay of light and shadow, in the silence of a forest where time seems suspended, there exists a dialogue that transcends language and defies the limitations of our mortal understanding. I remain forever haunted by the enigmatic eyes and the shifting form of the skinwalker, a presence that, in its own way, both inspired and terrified me. My journey into the redwoods was meant to be a retreat from the world, a sanctuary where I could find the creative spark that had long eluded me. Instead, it became a crucible in which the boundaries between art and life, reality and myth, were irrevocably blurred. I learned that the pursuit of inspiration is not without its perils, and that the deeper one delves into the unknown, the more one risks being consumed by it. Now, I carry the memory of that mysterious presence with me, a silent companion on days when the ordinary world feels too bright and too predictable. I know that somewhere among those towering redwoods, the skinwalker still roams, its form shifting like the pages of an unwritten story, waiting for the next soul brave enough to listen to its ancient song. And though I have left that haunted place behind, its echoes remain etched in my heart, a reminder that the search for truth is often a journey into realms where fear and wonder intertwine. This is my story, one of beauty, terror, and the relentless quest for inspiration in a world that is far more mysterious than it first appears. I am Isabella Izzy Ramirez, a writer whose journey into the redwoods opened a door to a realm where the boundaries of reality blur, and every shadow holds a secret. As I continue to write, I do so with the knowledge that some questions will forever remain unanswered, that some mysteries are destined to reside in the silent, timeless groves of the ancient forest. And though my manuscript remains unfinished, its incomplete pages are imbued with the raw truth of my experience, a truth that, like the redwoods themselves, will endure long after I have moved on from that enchanted, perilous sanctuary. I never imagined that a former life spent in the precise world of engineering could so easily unravel when confronted with mysteries beyond measurement. I am David Carter, once a man of equations and technical diagrams, now a solitary seeker of truth, hidden in the silent whispers of nature. After a personal crisis left my life in disarray, a crisis that stripped away my former certainties, I set out to rebuild myself far from the relentless clamor of city life. I purchased a modest, weathered cabin perched on the edge of a secluded lake in the Great Smoky Mountains near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, determined to rediscover both solace and meaning amid the enduring majesty of the natural world. The cabin, a simple wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, sat like a forgotten relic at the water's edge. From the moment I arrived, I was struck by the pervasive stillness of the place. The lake, An immense mirror of dark water, bordered by ancient pines and moss-draped cedars, exuded a quiet that was at once both inviting and ominous. I spent my first days methodically setting up the essentials, ensuring that the solar panels would capture enough sunlight to power a few basic appliances, rigging a rainwater collection system, and, most importantly, carving out a small workspace in a corner of the cabin where I could let my thoughts wander freely. I felt that, in this isolated haven, I might finally repair the fractures within myself. Mornings in the Smokies were transformative. I would awaken to a cool, damp light filtering through gaps in the weathered shutters, the mist rising off the lake like the slow exhalation of a sleeping giant. I took long, solitary walks along the lake's perimeter, marveling at the interplay of light and shadow as the day began. I recorded these moments in a leather-bound journal, my handwriting growing steadier with each passing day, as nature's timeless rhythms lulled my anxious mind. Yet, as I became accustomed to the predictable cadence of sunrise and sunset, an undercurrent of unease began to disturb the idyllic stillness. It started on a particularly early morning. I had risen before dawn, determined to capture the emerging light in a series of photographs. As I approached the lake's edge, I noticed a peculiar sight: faint, almost translucent figures standing silently on the far bank. At first, I assumed these were tricks of the early light, mere reflections of fog and tree silhouettes. But as I neared, it became clear that these were not simply natural formations. They moved with a slow deliberation, their outlines blurred as though they belonged to a world beyond the physical, and, for a fleeting moment, I sensed the presence of eyes, deep, sorrowful eyes that watched me from the darkness. The sight left me breathless. I stood there for several minutes, my rational mind racing to explain what I had seen. Had I been sleepwalking, or was the fog playing cruel tricks on my eyes? I dismissed the thought as a momentary lapse in judgment and returned to the cabin, unaware that this was only the first ripple in a growing tide of uncanny occurrences. Over the following weeks, subtle signs began to accumulate, each one chipping away at the neat compartments of logic that had long defined my existence. I found that the atmosphere around the lake would sometimes change inexplicably. One evening, while repairing a loose board on the cabin's porch, I felt as though the air itself had shifted. A sudden, almost imperceptible chill that swept over me. I paused, glancing up from my work, and noticed that the trees seemed to lean in closer, their dark silhouettes etched sharply against a starless sky. That night, as I lay awake in bed, the stillness was punctuated by what sounded like faint, indistinct whispers carried on the wind. I could not make out any words, but the tone was unmistakably mournful, as if the lake itself were reciting a dirge for some ancient loss. I turned to my scientific training for solace. I set up a series of recording devices around the cabin, aiming them in the direction of the lake and along the wooded perimeter. Each morning, I would retrieve the data and analyze it, searching for patterns or anomalies that might lend a rational explanation to the phenomena. At first, the recordings were disappointingly mundane: a chorus of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. But then, amid the ambient sounds of night, I began to detect something else, a series of soft, overlapping murmurs that seemed to rise and fall in a rhythm all their own. They were not loud enough to be clearly heard during the recording, yet on playback their presence was undeniable. I could not determine whether these were simply wind-induced echoes, or something far more deliberate. In my quest for clarity, I turned to the local lore. I visited a small library in Gatlinburg, and spent hours poring over local histories and oral traditions. I learned that this region had long been the subject of eerie tales, whispered about in hushed tones by locals. According to some accounts, the lake had been the site of a tragic event, a calamity involving a family lost to the water in a storm decades ago. Over time, The memory of that loss had woven itself into the fabric of the place, and some believed that the spirits of those drowned still lingered, forever bound to the waters. I recalled the images of the ghostly figures from that early morning, and wondered if perhaps I was witnessing the remnants of such a tragedy. Still, a part of me, ever the engineer, was determined to find a rational explanation. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the folklore of the Smokies, a woman in her late 70s named Marjorie. Over a cup of bitter coffee in a creaking old diner, she recounted stories of the lake that sent shivers down my spine. With a voice both gentle and grave, she explained how some of the children lost in the old tales were said to roam the banks at dawn, their spirits unable to move on from the trauma of their untimely deaths. "They call them the weeping children," she said, her eyes clouded with memory. Not malicious, mind you, but tragic souls searching for something they lost. Her words, delivered with a mix of reverence and sorrow, made my scientific skepticism tremble on the edge of reluctant acceptance. I began to notice further manifestations of these inexplicable forces. One morning, while I was having breakfast on the cabin's small deck, I caught sight of a figure near the water's edge, no more solid than a wisp of fog, yet unmistakably human in its shape. It lingered for a few heartbeats before melting into the mists, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of grief. The experience left me shaken, and that evening, as I sat in the dim light of a single lamp, I found my thoughts consumed by the idea that perhaps the lake was more than just a body of water. Perhaps it was a repository of memories and sorrows that refused to be washed away by time. Despite the mounting evidence of something beyond the ordinary, I clung to my scientific perspective. I continued to document everything meticulously, noting the dates, times, and atmospheric conditions of each anomalous event. I even set up a night vision camera, hoping to capture a clear image of the spectral visitors. One night, while reviewing the footage in the pale light of my study, I saw something that defied all explanation. In a grainy frame, illuminated only by the faint glow of moonlight reflecting off the lake, I saw a child's figure standing motionless at the water's edge. The child's eyes, though blurred by the limitations of the camera, seemed to hold a deep, unspoken sorrow. I rewound the tape repeatedly, searching for confirmation, but the image was as ephemeral as a dream, here one moment and gone the next. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake in the darkness of my small bedroom, my mind churning with thoughts both analytical and deeply unsettled. I wondered if I had inadvertently disturbed forces that were best left undisturbed. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, seemed to whisper of secrets too heavy for human minds. In my dreams, I wandered along the lake's edge, guided by the soft, mournful voices of unseen children, their cries mingling with the sound of lapping water and the sigh of the wind. I awoke drenched in sweat, the echoes of their lament lingering in the silence of the pre-dawn darkness. The turning point came on a night when the boundary between the tangible and the spectral seemed to vanish entirely. I had been poring over my data for hours in the study, trying to reconcile the patterns of the recorded whispers with my own recollections, when a sudden, violent gust of wind shattered the stillness of the cabin. The windows rattled, and I was forced from my desk by the sheer force of the unexpected storm. I hurried outside, flashlight in hand, to see what the chaos might reveal. In that stormy, rain-soaked darkness, the lake transformed into a swirling maelstrom of water and shadows. It was then that I saw them, not as distant figures on the far bank, but up close and unmistakably real. As I stood on the drenched porch, I saw ghostly shapes emerging from the mist, their forms illuminated briefly by erratic flashes of lightning. They gathered at the water's edge, huddled together as if seeking solace from an unbearable grief. I felt a surge of both terror and profound sadness as I watched them, their silent vigil a stark reminder of the tragedy that had long haunted these waters. In that moment, the rational part of me, honed by years of logic and engineering, was overwhelmed by the palpable presence of loss. The spectral congregation seemed to be locked in an endless mourning, a perpetual lament for lives extinguished too soon. I moved slowly back into the safety of the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest, and shut the door against the storm. The memory of that vision seared itself into my mind, and I sat by the window long into the night, transfixed by the relentless pounding of the rain and the mournful, indistinct whispers that the wind carried. I realized then that my quest for rational explanations had brought me face to face with a truth I could neither deny nor fully understand. The lake, with its ghostly denizens and persistent echoes of sorrow, was a living monument to a past marred by tragedy, and its restless spirits demanded acknowledgment, even if I could only observe from a distance. In the days that followed, I attempted to resume a semblance of normalcy. I buried myself in routine, repairing the cabin, tending to a small garden, and even reading the latest technical journals in a bid to remind myself that the world of science still held sway over my existence. Yet, each time I stepped outside, I was confronted by the lingering presence of those spectral figures. In the soft light of dawn, I would catch glimpses of them on the far bank, standing as silent sentinels over the water. By midday, the oppressive weight of their sorrow would ease, only to return with the cool of the evening. I found that my days were punctuated by an unspoken dialogue with the lake, a conversation of glances and half-remembered whispers that spoke of an ancient grief. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and a deep, unyielding need for resolution, I decided to seek the counsel of a local spiritual practitioner who was said to have a profound connection with the natural and supernatural realms. Her name was Evelyn, and she lived in a small, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of Gatlinburg. I arrived at her home with a heavy heart and a mind brimming with questions. Over a pot of herbal tea, she listened quietly as I recounted my experiences, the ghostly apparitions at the lake's edge, the whispered voices that haunted the nights, and the overwhelming sense of sorrow that clung to the waters. With eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of many lifetimes, she told me that the lake was indeed a sacred and troubled place. "There is a tragedy here that has never been allowed to rest," she said softly. "The spirits you see are those of lost children, their voices carrying the weight of unfulfilled lives and forgotten promises. They are not malevolent in the sense of wishing harm upon you. They are simply bound by grief and the unyielding grip of memory." Her words resonated with a deep, intuitive truth that I had long tried to dismiss with data and logic. Evelyn advised me to perform a small ritual, a gesture of compassion and release, to help the spirits find some measure of peace. Though I hesitated, my scientific mind warring with the raw, emotional clarity of her message, I decided that I owed it to both myself and the restless souls to try. That evening, as twilight bled into night, I gathered a few tokens: a simple white candle, a handful of wildflowers I had collected near the water, and a small vial of water from the lake itself. I returned to the cabin, and, on its weathered front step, arranged the offerings in a quiet tribute to those lost voices. In a soft, measured tone, I spoke words of release and remembrance, asking the spirits to be free of the sorrow that had bound them for so long. For a long moment, nothing happened. I sat there in the cool, damp darkness, my breath clouding in the chill air, and waited. Then, as if in answer, the wind stirred. It whispered through the trees and across the water, carrying with it a sound that resembled a sigh, a release, a letting go. I felt a profound weight lift from my chest, as though the very act of acknowledging their pain had eased the burden they had carried for decades. I did not know whether my ritual had truly made a difference, but in that quiet moment, I felt a tentative harmony begin to replace the pervasive melancholy. Yet, despite this small reprieve, The haunting presence at the lake remained a constant part of my life. In the months that followed, I continued to live by the water, meticulously recording every unusual occurrence and striving to maintain a balance between my rational mind and the inexplicable mysteries that now defined my existence. I often found myself pondering the delicate interplay between science and spirit, logic and intuition, and I realized that my time in the Smokies had changed me irreversibly. I had come seeking to rebuild my life with reason and structure, only to discover that some parts of our world operate on a frequency that defies human understanding. Eventually, the relentless pull of the haunted lake began to take its toll on my fragile sense of equilibrium. Despite my best efforts to document and rationalize every phenomenon, there were nights when I would lie awake, haunted by the soft, sorrowful cries of unseen children and the distant lapping of water that seemed to speak of an unending lament. The apparitions would sometimes appear so vividly that I felt as though I were standing on the threshold of another realm, one where grief and beauty coexisted in a paradox that my mind could barely comprehend. One particularly harrowing night, as a dense fog rolled in from the lake and shrouded the cabin in an impenetrable gloom, I experienced an encounter that shattered the last vestiges of my inner calm. I had been awakened by an intense, inexplicable chill and the sound of gentle weeping, a sound so raw and filled with longing that it made my heart ache. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured outside, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. The beam of my light danced over the water, and for a few agonizing moments, I saw them, a small group of spectral figures gathered at the water's edge, their forms indistinct and their features blurred by the mist. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a blend of empathy, sorrow, and an almost unbearable sense of isolation. I stood there, paralyzed, as the figures slowly drifted away, as if carried off by an unseen current, leaving me alone with the echo of their lament. In the days that followed, I wrestled with the implications of that encounter. I had always prided myself on my ability to find answers, to reduce phenomena to data and theory. Yet here I was, confronted with a truth that defied such simple explanations, a truth that lay not in the realm of physics or chemistry, but in the deeper, often hidden layers of human experience and emotion. I began to realize that my journey had become a quest not for scientific validation, but for understanding, a search for meaning in the interplay of light and shadow, life and death. Eventually, the cumulative weight of these experiences led me to a decision that I had not anticipated when I first arrived at the cabin. The lake, with all its haunting beauty and sorrowful apparitions, had become both a refuge and a prison. I found that the more I tried to understand it, the more it began to erode the fragile boundaries between my rational self and the ineffable mystery of existence. I began to feel that my attempts to document and control the experience were futile, that some aspects of life were meant to remain as mysteries, silently pulsing beneath the surface of everyday reality. With a heavy heart and a mind forever altered by the presence of those lost voices, I decided it was time to leave. Packing up my belongings was a quiet, somber affair, a farewell not only to a place but to a chapter of my life that had been marked by both profound loss and unexpected beauty. On my final morning, as I walked along the familiar path toward my truck, I paused at the water's edge one last time. The lake was shrouded in the soft light of early dawn, and for a moment I felt the ghostly brush of a hand against my cheek, a gentle, almost imperceptible farewell. I did not know if it was a final goodbye from the spirits I had come to know, or merely a trick of the light and my weary mind, but it was enough to convince me that my time there had reached its natural end. I drove away slowly, the towering pines and mist-shrouded lake receding in the rearview mirror like fragments of a half-remembered dream. In the months that followed, I tried to reintegrate into a life governed by routine and reason, yet the memories of that haunted shore continued to echo in my thoughts. Even now, in the safety of a busy city and the predictable rhythm of daily life, I sometimes pause to listen for that soft, sorrowful cry or the gentle lapping of water that once carried 1,000 unspoken laments. I realize that I have been irrevocably changed by my time at the lake. I learned that there are realms of existence that resist the neat categories of science and logic, realms where beauty and terror are inextricably intertwined, and where the weight of past sorrows lingers like a silent promise. I keep my journal, each page a testament to those experiences, meticulous notes on atmospheric conditions, detailed sketches of ghostly apparitions, and the raw, unfiltered emotions that accompanied each encounter. I sometimes reread those entries with a mixture of academic detachment and profound melancholy, aware that I have captured not just events, but pieces of my own soul that were laid bare by the haunted waters of the Smokies. I have come to accept that while I may never fully understand the mystery of the lake, its presence has given me a gift, a reminder that life is more than mere equations and predictable outcomes. It is a tapestry woven with threads of both sorrow and wonder, and sometimes the most important truths are those that defy explanation. This is my account, as honest and raw as the chill that still sometimes runs down my spine when I think back to that final night by the lake. I am David Carter, a former engineer who once sought refuge in the precise world of logic, only to be confronted by the immeasurable depths of human loss and the haunting beauty of spirits that linger in the twilight. I left the Smokies behind with a mind forever open to the mysteries that lie beyond the reach of science, and a heart heavy with both regret and gratitude. The haunted waters of the lake continue to whisper in my dreams, a soft, unending chorus that reminds me that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And while I may have returned to the realm of certainty and modernity, the echo of those lost voices will forever be etched into the quiet corners of my soul. I arrived at the farmhouse on a late October afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the gentle rise of the Hudson Valley hills, casting long, melancholic shadows over a landscape that promised both solitude and a quiet kind of beauty. I am Lydia Montgomery, an artist with a restless heart and an insatiable need to capture the subtle mysteries of life on canvas and in verse. After years of living amid the frenetic pulse of the city, I craved a place where time slowed, where the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the murmur of a distant brook could serve as the backdrop for my creative journey. The farmhouse, tucked away in a small copse near Woodstock, New York, seemed the perfect retreat. A modest, weathered structure that had clearly seen many seasons and held secrets in its creaking floorboards and faded paint. The first days were filled with a quiet, almost ritualistic settling in. I spent long hours cleaning and repairing, gently coaxing life back into the old house with fresh coats of whitewash on peeling walls and careful mending of broken window sashes. Each stroke of the brush, each measured nail hammered into splintered wood, felt like a meditation, a reaffirmation of my desire to rebuild not only a dwelling, but also a part of myself that had been battered by the ceaseless demands of urban life. I arranged my sparse belongings in a modest studio that overlooked a small clearing in the woods, a clearing that, at first glance, appeared bathed in the soft, forgiving light of nature, a sanctuary of calm and quiet promise. For a while, I allowed myself to be lulled by the serene rhythm of the countryside. Mornings began with the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a thrush, while evenings were graced by the slow transformation of sky and land into a tapestry of purples and deep blues. I would wander the property with a sketchbook in hand, capturing the interplay of light and shadow on the gnarled trunks of oak and maple, feeling that my art was finally free from the constraints of urban grays and hurried brushstrokes. Yet, even in those moments of delicate peace, a subtle unease began to weave its way into the fabric of my daily life, a feeling that there was something hidden in the folds of the woods, something that lingered just beyond the edge of perception. It started with small anomalies. I began to notice odd symbols etched into the bark of several trees along the perimeter of my property. At first, I dismissed them as the careless carvings of previous inhabitants or local teenagers seeking to leave their mark. But the symbols were neither crude nor random. They bore an unsettling precision, as though inscribed by an artisan's hand steeped in ancient lore. Each mark was different, a swirling spiral here, an intersecting series of lines there, yet all evoked a sense of foreboding mystery. I found myself returning to the trees over and over, tracing the patterns with my fingertips, trying to decipher their meaning, but no explanation occurred to me, and the images began to haunt my sketches and my dreams alike. Then there were the sounds. On some evenings, as dusk settled over the valley and the world took on a muted, otherworldly glow, I would hear a low, rhythmic chanting drifting from somewhere deep within the woods. At first, it was so faint that I thought it might be the rustle of the wind or the distant hum of a radio carried on a breeze. But gradually, the chanting became more distinct, more insistent, a series of words that seemed to rise and fall in a steady cadence, echoing through the trees with a strange, almost hypnotic quality. I would sit by my window for long, sleepless nights, straining to catch the fragments of those voices, wondering if they were the echoes of an ancient incantation or merely the trick of an overactive mind in the quiet dark. I attempted to dismiss these occurrences with rational explanations, attributing them to the quirks of an old house in a secluded spot, to the natural interplay of sound in a forest at night. Yet, the more I tried to reason them away, the more persistent they became, like unwelcome visitors who refused to be ignored. In the light of day, the symbols on the trees would appear as nothing more than the remnants of a long-forgotten graffiti. But in the soft, uncertain light of dusk, they pulsed with a kind of energy that made my heart beat a little faster. And the chanting, it grew bolder with each passing week, until on several occasions I found myself compelled to follow its source, as if drawn by a magnetism that defied my better judgment. I remember one particular evening vividly. The sky was overcast, and a cool mist had begun to settle over the clearing, blurring the edges of the familiar landscape. I stepped outside with a cup of tea, intending to simply enjoy the fresh, damp air when I heard it, a deep, sonorous chant that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the woods. The sound was both mournful and strangely uplifting, a paradox of emotion that stirred something in the recesses of my soul. I walked toward the sound, my bare feet soft on the dew-laden grass, until I reached a spot near the trees where the chanting was most audible. There, in the dimming light, I saw a faint glow, a circle of light, as if a small fire had been set, though no flames danced in its center. Instead, the light revealed more of the carved symbols on the trees, now illuminated in a ghostly radiance that made them appear almost otherworldly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, transfixed by the sight and the sound, feeling that I had stumbled upon something profoundly significant, something that bridged the gap between the mundane and the mystical. Unable to shake the intense pull of that experience, I began to research the history of the area with a fervor that surprised even me. I visited the local historical society in Woodstock and pored over old records, seeking any mention of similar symbols or rituals connected to these woods. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. There were murmurs of an old witch's curse, an ancient malediction said to have been cast upon the land centuries ago by a woman scorned and betrayed. The legends described how the witch, in her anguish, had inscribed symbols upon the trees and performed rituals that echoed through the ages, binding the land to her sorrow and rage. Over time, her curse had become woven into the very soil and stone of the valley, manifesting in inexplicable phenomena that defied logical explanation. I learned that, according to these accounts, those who dared to build upon the cursed clearing might find themselves haunted by the echoes of that ancient tragedy, a persistent, insidious presence that would never allow them to forget the past. The more I read, the more I felt as though I were descending into a labyrinth of myth and memory, where the line between history and legend blurred into one endless tapestry of loss and longing. I began to sense that my own arrival at the farmhouse was no mere coincidence, but part of a larger, fated design that I could neither escape nor fully comprehend. The idea that I might be unwittingly living in a place marked by such sorrow filled me with both dread and an inexplicable, almost magnetic fascination. In my search for deeper understanding, I sought out a local folklorist named Mary Ann, a gentle, elderly woman whose eyes sparkled with the wisdom of one who had spent a lifetime listening to the land and its stories. Mary Ann lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of Woodstock, surrounded by wildflowers and old stone walls that seemed to guard secrets of their own. Over cups of herbal tea in her cozy, book-lined living room, I recounted the strange occurrences at my farmhouse, the carvings, the chanting, the sense of a presence watching me from the shadows of the trees. Mary Ann listened with a solemn nod, her wrinkled hands folded over a delicate lace tablecloth, and then she spoke in a measured, almost musical tone. "Lydia, what you are experiencing is the echo of a deep, ancient pain," she said softly. "The curse that haunts these woods is not born of malice, but of sorrow, of love betrayed and life lost. The symbols you see are not random. They are the remnants of a ritual, a way of marking the land with grief so that it may never be forgotten. And the chanting, my dear, is the lament of those who were wronged, a dirge that has been carried on the wind for generations." Mary Ann's words, tender yet laden with the weight of sorrow, resonated within me in a way that defied the cold logic I had clung to for so long. She went on to explain that while the curse was powerful, it was not invincible. There existed ancient rites, old rituals of appeasement and release that could offer a measure of protection, if only temporarily, from the relentless grip of the past. Mary Ann offered to help me perform one of these rituals, a gentle ceremony designed to honor the lost souls and perhaps ease the oppressive energy that had begun to saturate my days and nights. I agreed, and together we planned the rite for a night when the moon was full, and the valley's silence would be most profound. In the days leading up to the ritual, I found myself both anxious and strangely hopeful. I spent long hours preparing a small altar in the clearing near my farmhouse, gathering wildflowers, a few candles, and a bowl of water from a nearby stream, a symbolic gesture of renewal and cleansing. The act of preparation itself became a meditative process, a deliberate confrontation with the mystery that had taken root in my heart. On the night of the ritual, the air was cool and crisp, and the sky was awash with the silver light of a full moon. I walked to the clearing with Mary Ann by my side, her presence a quiet assurance amid the uncertainty of the night. We arranged the offerings carefully, setting the candles in a rough circle and placing the bowl of water in the center as a focal point of our intention. Mary Ann began to chant softly, a low, rhythmic incantation that seemed to harmonize with the natural sounds of the woods. I joined in hesitantly at first, my voice trembling, but soon found a strange comfort in the repetition of those ancient words. As our voices merged with the whispering wind, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the land itself were acknowledging our plea for peace. For a time, it seemed as though the curse might be lifted, if only for a brief moment. The oppressive energy that had weighed upon me seemed to lighten, and I dared to imagine that perhaps the restless spirits, too, might find solace in our offering. But, as the night wore on and the ritual reached its quiet crescendo, the familiar, haunting sound of distant chanting began to rise once more from the depths of the woods. The gentle melody of our incantation was overpowered by the raw, sorrowful intonations that had first drawn me into this mystery. I looked up at Mary Ann, whose eyes were filled with both empathy and resignation, and I realized that our small act of remembrance, though deeply meaningful, was not enough to erase the curse that clung to this land. In the days that followed the ritual, I noticed that the carved symbols on the trees remained, now appearing even more pronounced as if they had been illuminated by an unseen light. The distant chanting, too, returned with a renewed intensity, echoing through the valley at dusk in a haunting refrain that filled me with both longing and despair. My attempts to capture these phenomena in sketches and words became a daily ritual, a way to bear witness to the interplay of beauty and sorrow that defined my existence in that cursed clearing. I poured my emotions onto canvases, creating images that blended the soft, gentle hues of nature with stark, jarring symbols that seemed to pulse with an ancient, inexorable grief. In my art, I sought to reconcile the duality of my experience, the desire to celebrate the serene majesty of the Hudson Valley and the relentless reminder of a past that refused to be forgotten. Over time, the weight of the curse began to seep into my daily life in ways that were impossible to ignore. I found that my sleep was often restless, punctuated by dreams in which I wandered endless forests, where the trees whispered secrets in a language older than memory. I would awaken with the sensation of being watched, a subtle pressure at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes tracked my every movement. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of creative freedom, gradually transformed into a place of uneasy isolation, a beautiful prison where the echoes of ancient sorrow coexisted with fleeting moments of inspiration. I tried to carry on with my work, determined to document every aspect of this strange, bittersweet existence. Yet there were days when the very act of painting became an exercise in pain, as the images I created seemed to mirror not only the external beauty of the valley, but also the inescapable darkness that lurked beneath. I began to question whether my arrival here had been a stroke of serendipity or a cruel twist of fate, a call to bear witness to a curse that was as inexorable as the passage of time itself. My friends back in the city wrote to me with concern, their words filled with disbelief at the intensity of my accounts. They urged me to return to a life of light and warmth, to leave behind the haunted clearing and its legacy of sorrow. But I, too, had become entangled in the delicate web of this place, my very identity now intertwined with the ghosts of its past. After many long, contemplative months, I reached a painful yet inevitable conclusion. The farmhouse and the cursed clearing, with all their quiet beauty and persistent melancholy, had come to define a chapter of my life that I could neither continue nor entirely abandon. I had tried, with every fiber of my being, to soothe the restless energy that clung to the land, to perform rituals, to create art that would exorcise the lingering grief. But the signs only grew stronger, the chants more insistent, and the symbols more vivid in their silent testimony of a past steeped in sorrow. It was as if the very earth had absorbed the pain of centuries, and no amount of creative catharsis or ritualistic appeasement could fully cleanse it. One crisp winter morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the Hudson Valley and painted the frost-covered fields in shades of soft blue and silver, I made the decision to leave. I packed my few belongings with a heavy heart, each item a memory of the time I had spent in that land of conflicting beauty and unyielding grief. As I stood on the threshold of the farmhouse for the last time, I turned slowly to gaze back at the clearing where the trees still bore the carved symbols, and the faint sound of distant chanting drifted on the cold breeze. In that moment, I felt both an overwhelming sense of loss and a fragile hope that perhaps, in time, the curse might one day be lifted, or at least softened by the passage of years. I left the Hudson Valley with a mixture of sorrow and relief, a bittersweet farewell to a chapter of my life that had irrevocably altered me. The memories of that cursed clearing, of the eerie symbols etched into ancient bark and the relentless, mournful cadence of unseen voices remain with me like a half-remembered dream. In the years that followed, I continued to paint and write, my art now marked by an indelible sense of melancholy and a deep understanding of the interplay between beauty and sorrow. My canvases often evoke the stark contrasts of light and shadow that defined those long days and nights, and my words are imbued with the silent, aching echo of a curse that once haunted a secluded farmhouse in the Hudson Valley. I sometimes find myself gazing at a particular painting, a study of a dark forest with faint, glowing symbols, and a lone figure standing at the edge of a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In that image, I see not just the ghost of a cursed past, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in places burdened by ancient grief, there is beauty to be found, and stories worth telling. Though I no longer reside in that haunted space, the experience has left an indelible mark upon my soul, a quiet echo that continues to whisper of secrets long buried beneath the earth and among the trees. I now live in a modest studio in a bustling part of the city, where the relentless hum of modern life contrasts sharply with the quiet, persistent murmur of the valley I once called home. Yet, in the quiet moments between the rush of daily obligations, I close my eyes and remember the soft light of dawn over the Hudson, the delicate interplay of frost and shadow, and the solemn, insistent chanting that once filled the twilight. I recall the gentle guidance of Mary Ann, the solemn beauty of the ritual we performed, and the inescapable truth that some parts of our world remain shrouded in mystery, defying explanation and beckoning us to look deeper into the human heart. This is my truth, a life marked by both luminous inspiration and the quiet, persistent echo of a curse that was never truly lifted. I am Lydia Montgomery, an artist whose journey to a secluded farmhouse in the Hudson Valley opened my eyes to the eternal dance of beauty and sorrow, to the fragile boundary between the seen and unseen. Though I have moved on, the legacy of that cursed clearing remains with me, a silent companion in every brushstroke and every carefully chosen word. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the city's lights fade into a gentle hum, I swear I can still hear the faint, rhythmic chanting drifting on the wind, a reminder that some mysteries, however painful, are meant to be remembered, and that even in the midst of loss, there is an enduring beauty that calls us home. I left Atlanta behind with a mix of determination and a secret yearning for escape, a desire to trade the endless concrete maze and cacophony of urban life for something quieter, more honest, more wild. My name is Jordan Willis, and I'd spent years honing a practical mind, solving problems with logic and reason, convinced that the natural world could be tamed through careful planning and engineering. But something inside me rebelled against that orderly existence. I craved a fresh start, a chance to reconnect with nature on its own terms. So I purchased a small plot of land in the Appalachian foothills near Dahlonega, Georgia, and set about building a rustic, off-grid cabin, determined to forge a life of self-reliance far from the relentless pace of Atlanta. The first weeks were an exhilarating challenge. I spent long days hauling logs, erecting walls by hand, and installing a rudimentary solar array and wind turbine to power the essentials. The labor was backbreaking and unforgiving, yet every splinter and sweat-soaked moment filled me with a sense of accomplishment. There was a raw honesty in the work, a palpable connection between my own struggles and the ancient earth beneath my feet. I quickly learned the rhythms of the land, how the sunlight filtered through the canopy in the early morning, how the wind whispered through the pines at dusk, and for a time I felt at peace with the isolation. It wasn't long, though, before the oddities began. I was out one late afternoon, checking on my modest vegetable garden near the edge of the property, when I noticed a sycamore tree that had always stood proud at the border of my land. I'd admired its broad, mottled trunk and expansive, peeling bark since the day I arrived. But that day, something was off. Etched into its smooth, pale bark were strange markings, lines that curved and intersected with a deliberate precision that seemed far too refined to be the work of casual vandalism or the erratic nibblings of an animal. The symbols were unfamiliar, almost ritualistic in appearance, and they seemed to shimmer in the fading light as if alive with their own purpose. I traced my finger lightly over one of the swirling patterns, feeling an unexpected chill ripple through my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled upon something meant to remain hidden, a secret left behind by those who had come before me. At first, I chalked it up to local graffiti, or perhaps the markings of a previous owner with a penchant for mystery. I told myself it was nothing more than an odd quirk of a tree, but as the days passed, more trees revealed similar carvings. I began to notice that the sycamores along the edge of my property, usually silent sentinels of nature's indifferent beauty, now bore these inexplicable inscriptions. I even discovered one carved in a manner that suggested it was done not with crude tools, but with deliberate care and an almost artistic touch. I took photos and made detailed sketches, my logical mind churning over possibilities. Could it be the work of a local artist, a prank by some wayward teenager, or perhaps remnants of an old, forgotten tradition? Yet none of these explanations satisfied me. There was something deeply unsettling about the symbols, something that resonated with an unspoken dread. Then came the humming. It started as a faint vibration in the background of my nights, barely noticeable against the chorus of crickets and rustling leaves. At first, I believed it was merely the natural murmur of the wind as it passed through the gaps in the trees, but gradually the sound grew in clarity and persistence, a low, continuous hum that seemed to emanate from the woods themselves. I would lie in bed in the dead of night, eyes wide in the darkness, listening as the sound pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. It was as though the forest had a secret song, one that no human was meant to hear, and every night the hum grew louder, more insistent. I began recording the sound with a digital recorder, setting it up on a tripod near my cabin. When I later played back the audio, I could hear not only the natural sounds, but also a subtle undertone, a resonance that vibrated deep in my bones, carrying a note of melancholy and something else that I couldn't name. At first, I tried to explain it all away with reason. I told myself that the symbols were remnants of local folklore, and that the humming was merely the result of wind channeled through the peculiar formations of the trees. I pored over books on local history and folklore, searching for any mention of ritual carvings on sycamore bark or natural phenomena that might account for a low, persistent hum. I even consulted with a couple of neighbors, older folks who had lived in the area for decades, but they only offered vague, dismissive remarks, old wives' tales and fanciful legends, nothing that matched the vivid clarity of what I'd experienced. Despite my best efforts to maintain a rational perspective, a growing sense of unease began to infiltrate my daily life. There were nights when the humming seemed to seep into my dreams, transforming into a deep, malevolent murmur that left me waking in cold sweats, heart pounding as if chased by unseen forces. I started to wonder if there was a darker presence at work, something that defied the boundaries of natural explanation. My days became a strange blend of hard manual labor and a mounting dread that clung to me like a second skin. Even the simple act of walking through the forest filled me with a sense of being watched. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of dark, indistinct shapes among the trees that vanished when I turned to look directly. I began to question whether the sycamore carvings and the eerie humming were connected, parts of a larger, inexplicable phenomenon that I was somehow entangled in. One particularly cool evening, after a long day of setting up additional solar panels and repairing a section of the cabin's roof, I found myself sitting on the weathered porch, trying to shake off the day's fatigue. The sky was a deep indigo, and the first stars were timidly appearing overhead. I sipped a cup of lukewarm coffee and listened to the forest settle into its nocturnal rhythms. Then, amid the usual chorus of nocturnal sounds, I heard it, a distinct, almost guttural murmur that rose above the low hum I'd grown accustomed to. It was not the sound of wind or the scurry of small animals, but something else entirely. The sound carried a weight, an intensity that made my skin prickle. I strained my ears, trying to decipher it, and for a moment I thought I heard a word. No, a name. Something whispered in a language I did not know. The sound receded as quickly as it had come, leaving me with an unshakable chill and a mind swirling with questions. I spent the next several nights in a state of hypervigilance, meticulously documenting every occurrence. I adjusted the recorder's settings, experimented with different placements, and even set up a motion-sensitive camera near the sycamore trees. I was determined to gather evidence, to find a rational basis for what was happening. And yet, every time I reviewed the recordings, the same unsettling patterns emerged. The persistent hum, the occasional, barely audible whispers that seemed to shift in tone, as if laden with sorrow and malice in equal measure. The images captured by the camera were no better, a series of blurred silhouettes that moved among the trees in the twilight, figures that were impossible to identify. My logical mind rebelled at the thought that my carefully gathered data could not be reconciled with the familiar laws of physics and biology. Yet, the more I analyzed the evidence, the more I was forced to confront the possibility that something truly unexplainable was at work. In the midst of this growing disquiet, I decided to seek counsel beyond the realm of technical manuals and academic journals. I reached out to a local spiritual advisor, a woman known simply as Sister Mary Ann, who had dedicated her life to bridging the gap between the physical and the spiritual worlds. Her presence was calm and unassuming, her eyes kind but heavy with the wisdom of years spent listening to the unspoken stories of the land. When I visited her small chapel on the outskirts of Dahlonega, I recounted my experiences in halting, earnest detail. The carvings on the sycamore trees, the relentless humming, and the eerie sensations of being watched in the dark. Sister Mary Ann listened intently, nodding slowly as if each of my words carried an echo of a truth she had known all her life. She explained that the land here was steeped in ancient energy, a blend of natural resonance and the residual echoes of past sorrows. In local lore, some spoke of a devil's presence that could manifest in subtle ways, leaving behind signs that defied easy explanation. According to her, the carvings might have been a kind of protective ward, or perhaps a mark left by those who had once encountered this presence and sought to understand or contain it. Her words, delivered in a measured, almost hypnotic cadence, both comforted and unsettled me. She offered to perform a blessing, a quiet ritual intended to ease the oppressive energy and provide me with a measure of spiritual protection. I agreed, though a part of me remained skeptical, clinging to my hard-won rationality, even as my inner voice whispered that some things were beyond the scope of logic. That night, under a sky swollen with the light of a rising moon, Sister Mary Ann and I returned to the area near the sycamore grove. In the cool, gentle darkness, she led me in a prayer of release, using simple, ancient words that resonated with the murmur of the wind. We lit a few candles, their flames trembling in the soft breeze, and she sprinkled a handful of salt, a traditional offering meant to ward off negative energies, around the perimeter of the clearing. I watched as the light flickered against the carved bark of the sycamores, and, for a brief moment, I felt as if the oppressive hum receded, as if the very air had exhaled a long-held breath of relief. Yet, even as I clung to that fleeting sense of calm, deep down I knew that the presence was not so easily exorcised. It was as if the land itself was steeped in memories too ancient and powerful to be banished by mere words or rituals. In the days that followed the blessing, I tried to resume my routine with a cautious optimism. I went about my daily tasks, tending to repairs, gathering firewood, checking the off-grid systems that powered my modest home. But there was a persistent undercurrent of unease that I could not shake. The sycamore trees continued to bear their cryptic carvings, and the humming never fully disappeared. Sometimes, as I sat alone on my porch late in the evening, I would see a shadow move among the trees, a fleeting glimpse of a figure that dissolved as quickly as it appeared. It was as though the land was alive with secrets, its voice speaking in a language older than time. I began to document my experiences in a journal, writing long, reflective entries each night before I slept. I described the interplay of light and shadow, the way the trees seemed to lean toward my cabin as if drawn by an invisible force, and the feeling of being both an intruder and a participant in a story that had been unfolding long before I arrived. I noted the times when the humming would intensify, when it seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of my cabin, and the moments when I swore I could hear words, a name, a warning, whispered just beyond the reach of comprehension. Each entry was a struggle to reconcile my rational mind with the raw, unfiltered emotions that surged up within me. One night, when the air was thick with humidity and the sounds of the forest reached a fevered pitch, I experienced an encounter that nearly shattered my resolve. I had retired to bed early, exhausted from a day of relentless work and anxious contemplation, when I was abruptly awakened by a sensation that froze me in place. I lay in darkness, listening as the persistent hum swelled into a crescendo that seemed to emanate from all directions. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. I could not see anything in the pitch-black room, but I felt a presence hovering over me, a cold, invasive energy that seeped into my skin and raised the hairs on my arms. I mustered the courage to open my eyes, straining to see in the inky darkness, and, for a moment, I thought I saw a shape, a vaguely human outline, standing at the foot of my bed. It was not a threat as much as it was an overwhelming, sorrowful apparition, its features blurred and indistinct, yet its intent unmistakable. I lay there, heart pounding, too terrified to move, until gradually the presence receded, leaving me drenched in sweat and trembling with disbelief. In the cold light of morning, I wondered if it had been a hallucination conjured by exhaustion, or something far more real, a brush with the very essence of the devilish presence that had haunted these woods. The experience left me shaken to my core, and in the following weeks, I found myself oscillating between a desperate desire to understand and a paralyzing urge to flee. My once proud determination to live off-grid and reconnect with nature was now tinged with a deep, abiding fear. Every night, I waited for the hum to begin. Every day, I looked for fresh signs on the sycamore bark, and every creak in the darkness sent a jolt of apprehension through me. I started to believe that the presence was not a transient phenomenon, but a permanent fixture of this land, a force that had been here long before me, and would likely remain long after I was gone. I sought out every possible explanation. I reread every book on local legends, questioned old-timers at the nearby general store, and even revisited Sister Mary Ann for further guidance. Yet, with each new piece of information, the mystery deepened. The locals spoke in hushed tones of a devil's presence that lurked in these parts, a presence that could manifest in subtle ways, like the gentle hum of the wind or the cryptic carvings on ancient trees. They told stories of travelers who had dared to venture too deep into the woods and were never seen again, their fates a somber warning against meddling with forces beyond human control. I listened, part skeptical and part fearful, but I could not dismiss the conviction in their voices. Eventually, I reached a crossroads. My off-grid haven, which had once promised a fresh start and a refuge from the urban grind, had become a place of constant vigilance and creeping dread. The practical side of me, ever the problem solver, tried to find ways to neutralize the strange phenomena. I recalibrated my recording equipment, adjusted the settings on my security cameras, and even experimented with environmental modifications, such as trimming back some of the overhanging branches that might be funneling sound. Yet nothing alleviated the overwhelming sense that I was not alone in these woods, that some ancient, malevolent force had laid claim to this land and was unwilling to be dislodged. Late one autumn night, as a chill wind stirred the dry leaves and the full moon cast ghostly patterns on the ground, I made a decision that would forever alter the course of my off-grid life. I packed a small bag with essentials, left behind the tools I had grown so reliant upon, and resolved to confront the presence head-on one final time. I would venture into the sycamore grove under the cover of darkness, determined to observe, to record, and, if possible, to challenge whatever force dwelled there. With my heart pounding and a heavy mix of dread and resolve in my chest, I stepped away from the relative safety of my cabin and walked into the woods. The grove was silent save for the rustle of leaves beneath my feet and the constant low hum that had become the soundtrack of my nights. I approached a particularly large sycamore, its trunk scarred by the strange carvings that now seemed almost to glow in the moonlight. I set my recorder on the ground and began to speak softly into it, describing what I saw and felt in that charged, eerie moment. As I moved closer to the tree, the air grew inexplicably cold, and I felt a pressure on my chest as though an unseen force were trying to pin me down. The humming intensified, swelling into a sound that vibrated in my very bones. In that moment, I sensed a presence behind me, a shadow, a figure, something that defied precise description. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and for a brief, heart-stopping second, I saw a shape moving among the trees. It was not human, nor was it entirely animal. It was something in between, a fluid mass of darkness and shifting outlines that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. I could not tell if it was coming toward me or simply passing by, but the sense of dread it evoked was undeniable. I ran back to the cabin as fast as my legs could carry me, the echo of my own footsteps and the distant, almost mocking hum chasing me all the way. Once inside, I bolted the door and sank to the floor, my mind reeling with terror and disbelief. I spent the rest of that night huddled in a corner, the recorder still running, as if capturing the residual whispers of the forest. By morning, I was exhausted and conflicted. On one hand, I was a man of logic, determined to find a rational explanation for every anomaly. On the other, I knew deep down that I had encountered something that defied all reason, a force that might be best left undisturbed. In the weeks that followed, I made a series of attempts to reclaim my sense of normalcy. I resumed the daily routines that had once given me solace, tending to the small garden, maintaining the cabin, even enjoying the breathtaking vistas of the Appalachian foothills. But every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the persistent murmur of a presence that would not be ignored. My nights were restless, punctuated by sudden awakenings and the faint echo of a hum that now seemed less like a background noise and more like a deliberate call. I began to document these moments in long, flowing entries in my journal, pouring out my thoughts, my fears, and my slowly eroding belief in a purely rational world. Eventually, I realized that the cost of trying to live here, of seeking refuge from the frantic pace of city life, had grown too high. The off-grid dream that had once seemed so liberating had become a prison of perpetual unease, haunted by a devilish presence I could neither dispel nor fully understand. I made the painful decision to leave the cabin behind, to return to a life where I could at least feel safe, even if it meant relinquishing the freedom I had so desperately sought. Packing up my few belongings was a somber affair, each item a reminder of the dreams I had once harbored and the dark reality that had ultimately forced me to abandon them. On my final morning, as I stood on the porch watching the mist rise slowly over the Appalachian hills and the sycamore trees swayed in an indifferent breeze, I felt an odd mixture of relief and regret. I took one last, long, lingering look at the grove, at the carvings that had marked this land with an ancient signature, and at the forest that had whispered both promise and peril into my soul. I did not know if the devilish hum or the shifting shadows would ever truly vanish, but I knew that I could no longer live under their constant, oppressive influence. I drove away slowly, the familiar sights of Atlanta's outskirts growing nearer with each passing mile, while behind me the Appalachian landscape receded into a haze of memories, of hope, of terror, and of a relentless mystery that had forever changed the way I viewed the world. In the safety of the city, amidst the hum of everyday life and the predictable rhythm of modern convenience, I sometimes catch myself thinking of that cabin, of the strange symbols carved into ancient sycamore bark, and of the eerie, continuous hum that once filled the nights. I wonder if the land still holds those secrets, if the devilish presence still lingers among the trees, waiting for the next unwary soul to venture too close. Though I have returned to a life governed by reason and routine, I carry with me the indelible imprint of those haunting days in the Appalachian foothills. I have learned that there are forces in this world that defy our neat categories of logic and science, forces that whisper through the sycamore leaves and resonate in the spaces between heartbeats. And while I sometimes long for the simplicity and raw beauty of that off-grid life, I also know that some mysteries, once encountered, are too heavy to bear, too deep to plumb without risking one's very sanity. This is my story, a journey from the frenetic pulse of Atlanta to the ancient, whispering woods of Dahlonega, and back again. I am Jordan Willis, a man who sought solace in the wilderness, only to find himself face to face with forces that challenge the very foundations of reason. I learned that in the quiet depths of the Appalachian foothills, beneath the watchful eyes of weathered sycamore trees, there exists a realm where beauty and terror dance in an eternal, unsettling waltz. And though I left that place behind, its echoes still linger in my mind, a constant reminder that not all that calls itself nature is benign, and that sometimes the most profound truths are those that shatter the illusion of control we so desperately cling to. I write these words now in the relative safety of the city, aware that my experience remains a private, unsettling chapter of my life, a chapter that I can revisit in quiet moments, with a shudder and a reluctant sense of wonder. I have come to accept that my time in the Appalachian woods has changed me irrevocably. I no longer view the world solely through the lens of logic and calculation. I have learned that there are mysteries out there that resist explanation, mysteries that can inspire both awe and terror in equal measure. And so, while I have left my cabin and the haunted sycamores behind, I carry with me the memory of that relentless, otherworldly hum, and the unsettling impression of eyes that watched me in the dark, a reminder that some doors, once opened, are not easily closed, and that the wilderness, in all its rugged beauty, is also a keeper of secrets far older and deeper than any of us can imagine.